Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Ribbon's Call Trust Identity Assurance Virtual Summit. Wish we could be in person, but the pandemic has put paid to that. I wish to thank you for your attendance today at the EMEA Summit. I believe you'll find the session informative, thought-provoking, and I especially look forward to hearing the views for the panel session moderated by Patrick Donegan, principal analyst from Hardstance, who specializes in IT and telecom security. I also expect a healthy debate in the Q&A section at the end. Identity assurance challenge to our industry is exacerbated by the pandemic. It means that nobody trusts the phone number anymore, and that's not in the address book, either on the fixed network or the mobile networks. There's too many spam calls, nuisance calls, possible fraud calls. So either let it go to voicemail if they've got one, or let it ring out. The USA has legislated to resolve it through stir and shaken, and every US service provider must implement a solution to reduce spam calls and fraudulent calls. Us in the rest of the world, the problem's not as bad yet, but we're starting to see those requests, particularly as the 4G networks move to VoLTE and the 2G, 3G networks are turned off, to add an identity assurance capability. And as that problem ramps, it's becoming a governmental priority across the rest of the world. So expect that governance coming our way. In the audience today, as you can see from the many company logos on the slide, it's really a cross-section of our industry, from wholesale, national and local carriers from across EMEA, that the Ribbon Call Trust framework was built for. The Ribbon solution you're going to hear about today is a combination of our products in the network, which gathers data, enforces policy while leveraging the cloud-hosted identity hub. The solution addresses the problems before us today, but it's a framework. Its framework is built to solve the bigger picture problem we will expand on today. I believe that Ribbon has the global knowledge to be your trusted long-term partner to solve this major challenge in our industry today. Enjoy the seminar. I'd like now to introduce you to my colleague Daniel Techman, one of the main organizers for today's event, who'll take you through the summit agenda. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, David. Let me go ahead and turn on my webcam. There we go. And move on to the agenda here. So I will run through the agenda, and then I will be handing it off to Patrick in our moderated panel session. We are happy to have three representatives from the operator domain. We thought that was real important to make sure that we kind of put a cross-section of the industry view out there, and more importantly, hopefully for everyone in the audience, you'll hear some things that resonate with, hey, that's happening, I'm hearing about that in my company as well. Then we'll move on to three presentations from Ribbon. Our CTO, Kevin Riley, will present the big picture. We'll keep him short to 15 minutes. We have to keep him on a leash. He can talk for hours. And then we'll move on. Ram Ramanathan will present on restoring customer trust in the phone. That will be our Ribbon Call Trust, our picture of that solution set. And then Shambhu Rai will come on and talk some more details about our Identity Hub services. We've just recently launched those. We'll take a break between 3:15 and 3:30. At that point, don't leave. Just go ahead and mute your microphones, but turn off, just walk away. Come back in 15 minutes for a moderated discussion. So we've got some other Ribbon experts who will be on the phone and be able to answer detailed questions. And we really want to make sure that we have a discussion item where we're getting as many questions answered as possible. And we'll bring David back for closing remarks and be done by 5 p.m. These times, by the way, are all Central Time. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Patrick. Okay, so Patrick, it's all yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Dan, and good afternoon, good morning, everybody, wherever you happen to be. Delighted to be able to participate in this session with you today. We have three terrific panelists three speakers with a carrier background working for leading operators in the European and international markets. I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves. They are Amy Sewell from Sky, Philippe Foucault from Orange, and Katia Gonzalez Gutierrez from BICS. I'm going to go with ladies first. Amy, would you be kind enough to share with us who you are and exactly what you do for a living to start us off?
Hello there, can you hear me?
We can.
Brilliant. So I'm Amy Sewell, as Patrick has said. I'm the Technical Compliance Manager at Sky, Sky UK Limited. So I've been working at Sky for 12 years in the compliance team, and that involves all sorts of areas of compliance, but in particular compliance to the Ofcom general conditions, under which there are loads of requirements around nuisance call handling and how we as a communications provider are responsible for protecting our customers, and that's why I'm here today.
Fantastic. Katia, tell us about yourself.
Yes,
Katia,
hello. Yes, I'm here. So my name is Katia Gonzalez. I'm Head of Fraud and Security at BICS. I've been working here for, well, 11 years. That's a lot. We like to say at BICS that we are an international wholesale provider that enable and make possible global communications. So what we do basically is deliver and enable global connectivity across our partners, and that is operators, that can be other carriers, the digital service provider, actually any party that needs any kind of telco communication. And well, within this sphere, one of the main issues at the moment is fraud and security. So we're seeing a lot of these growing across the market. So I'll be happy to share all this experience with you.
Thank you, Katia. I should have mentioned, just so the audience knows, I think we've had issues getting Katia up on video this morning, but that's fine. I should say that we do, you know, whilst we're not able to validate her identity via video, we do very much know who she is, and over the course of what she has to say, I think you'll be very, very convinced that who you are seeing is indeed Katia from BICS over the course of the next 45 minutes. Let me invite Philippe now to introduce yourself, if you would.
Certainly. Hi, everyone. My name is Philippe Foucault. I'm with Orange Labs Networks. I've been working for Orange for something like 20 years now. And I participate in international organizations, standards development organizations, and also provide technical support to our engineering teams internally, to all affiliates essentially, and also to policy teams with our discussions with the national regulatory authorities. And obviously that includes number of assertions and mechanisms like stir or shaken, which we'll be talking about in a moment. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, stay with us if you would, Philippe, and take the very first question if you wouldn't mind. So what I think we'd be keen to understand in the first instance on behalf of all of the delegates here today, in France, what is Orange seeing in terms of nuisance calls? What are you seeing? How much of the problem do you actually understand? How much of it do you not understand? And what are the reasons for you having the perspective on it that you currently do?
Thanks, Patrick. Well, essentially, you said it all. The difficulty, yeah, almost. The difficulty we have, and you mentioned France. That's pretty much about it as far as Orange is concerned. Let's say Europe in general. And in terms of framing the problem, the figures that are floated around, and there have been some discussions at the National Assembly, because we've got a law now since last summer. We're talking about something like 2,000 calls, nuisance call a year, which is not a lot. And obviously, you need to ponder that with the nature of the call, since a nuisance call to a police station, for instance, it's probably not the same to a nuisance call to me. Now, having said that, as I said, Orange is fighting against this sort of practices. And in terms of, we've got mechanisms in place. And since September, between September and December, we've filtered out 100 million calls of that nature, allegedly. So between a few thousands and 1,000 million calls, it tells you how much we don't know about the problem. And that's one of the difficulties that we have, is that we haven't characterized the issue that much. We know about Nuisance Call. We don't know how many of those calls are actually related to number spoofing. Hence, we don't really know how much solutions like those that will make it possible to assert the calling party number will actually solve the solution. So that's pretty much the picture of the problem. And just to conclude with this, you've referred to national discussions. There have been discussions over the first few months of 2020 in France, which led to a law in the summer, which is called Loi Negelen, which mandates a mechanism to authenticate the numbers. I think that's the words that they use, without prescribing a particular mechanism. So the operators are free to use whatever means would be required. So it's very much like an obligation of and rather than means, if you see what I mean. But that's and almost regardless of whether we think a particular solution is relevant, we have to abide somehow. We're law-abiding, good law-abiding people, and we will do that. However, as an engineer, and my concern is a bit of a strong word, but is to make sure that the solution that we'll be designing is actually fit for purpose. Thank you.
Understood. Let me, if I may, Philippe, just clarify a couple of those numbers you shared with us. There were two sets of numbers, and I was a bit unclear on what you were referring to. So first of all, you referred, I think, to 2,000 nuisance calls a year. Now, can you just put that in context? I didn't quite know what you meant by that. And then secondly, I think I'm right in saying that when you referred to the fourth quarter, or I think you referred to a quarter, the fourth quarter of last year, I think, or the most recent quarter, I wasn't sure. You referred first of all to 100 million calls, and then a little while later you said 1,000 million calls. Would you mind just running us over those numbers again so that we're clear as to precisely what you mean by those numbers?
Sure. So the few thousands nuisance calls are the figures that were put forward during the questions to Parliament.
Right. It was a few thousand with an F, not 2,000. A few thousand. Sorry.
Yes, just a few thousand. I think the actual figure was 1,700 exactly.
Right. Okay.
I think that came from an observatory, an official observatory of nuisance calls.
Right.
Now, as you can tell, the rationale for putting forward a law is that there must be many more nuisance calls than that. However, we don't have an official observatory, and that's part of the problem, as I was saying.
Right.
So those were the figures put forward during the questions to Parliament. The 100 million calls that were blocked were the result of actions taken by Orange. There was a PR on this, so there's no secret there. Over the last quarter, between September and December 2019.
Okay.
Hang on.
Right.
Yes, exactly. Yes, 2019. I'm sorry.
Right.
You can look up the internet. It's public. So as you can tell, and then there are a number of various mechanisms that we use to block these nuisance calls, and filtering out, for example, calls coming from abroad using domestic numbers, if you like, is one of them. Again, it's in the PR. There's no secret there. Although that's obviously a bit more clever than just blocking calls, because there are legitimate calls in that environment. So I hope that clarifies the sort of references that I'm talking about. As you can tell, there's a huge difference between the official numbers and the lack of national observatory and the calls that we see internally and that we take action against.
Absolutely. So I think what I take away from that is that clearly the numbers are not on the gargantuan scale of the many, many billions, even tens of billions that we see in the US, for example, but 100 million a quarter in a major European market is still a substantial number. And in the absence of a comprehensive solution, it's logical to assume that that number is set to rise and almost certainly has over the course of this year. Would that sound about right?
Sort of. It's very difficult to predict, essentially, because it's a moving target. That's the problem. Right, our assumption is obviously that once you put some measures in place, those people who misuse numbers will actually try and find a different way to do the same thing, whether that would be going through a third party. Everyone who'd been working on fraud would know that. You're just as strong as the weakest link, as we say. So right. It's very difficult to say whether the numbers will rise, whether we sort of circumvented the problem, and how much a solution that, like STIR, for instance, would help sorting out the issue. However, given that it's economically driven, our expectation is that it's not going to go away anyway. So we have to do something about it, absolutely, especially if there's a law on this.
Understood. Okay, Amy, on the other side of the channel, what is Sky seeing in the UK market in terms of the nature of this problem? Are you able to scope it, put a number on it, quantify it in any way, or have you got no problems at all? What is it?
So we've got the same people calling our customers as I think Philippe and the French have calling their customers. I haven't got national figures, but we block, millions of calls per month. We are heavily regulated in the UK as a telecoms provider to make sure that we protect our customers. The telecoms industry is governed by the Ofcom general conditions, by the Information Commissioner's Office, the privacy and electronic regulations, and all sorts of things to protect our customers. And telephone scamming is really high on the list of problem areas, and there's no YouTube video to fix it.
Right, that makes perfect sense. So it sounds like the French National Assembly has come up with very, very specific and detailed requirements, not from a technical perspective, but in terms of a need to address this problem. Is the UK regulatory environment sufficiently clear to you? Is it sufficiently prescriptive, or are you anticipating that may change in the coming months?
It is already very prescriptive and has undergone evaluation through the NICC, through various bodies. I won't kill you all with acronyms. Many of you on the call will already know many of them, but there are standards and protocols that are discussed at national levels across industry, with different players invited to attend and to feed in. And Sky is obviously very active in those forums. So the general conditions were changed in 2018, and one of the major changes of them was to build in much more prescriptive measures on how to identify callers who are spoofing or spoofing so much, but presenting numbers which are not valid numbers, and therefore able to reach our network, and for us to then say, right, this is what we need you to do to stop them reaching our customers. So there are quite a lot of technical measures that we've introduced we already have a number of processes and customer protection schemes in place, because a lot of it is you can't always tell, to your point, Philippe, about calls coming in from abroad. If you've got a national presentation CLI, you're going to connect that call, and it's very difficult to block a number which actually could be Mr. Blogs down the road whose number's been spoofed. So that, you know, we are limited on how much we can do. So we spend, you know, a lot of our energy goes into educating customers and providing them with calling line features to protect them. So I think we'll get a chance to talk about solutions later, but to your question, Patrick, there is you know, a regulatory steer, not just in prescriptive measures, but also in voluntary groups that have been set up with the support of the ICO and Ofcom for major CPs to collaborate and work together to come up with ways to minimize the problem, if not to totally eliminate it. And the sorts of things that customers are seeing, you know, are exactly what you would expect, you know, calling up and being asked questions which you know, lead to them being financially detrimented. So it isn't just about, you know, blocking some calls and us losing some revenue. You know, we're very, very conscious in the UK of the major impact on society for this.
Right. So Katya, being an IPX carrier, it's not reasonable to ask you to or expect you to have particular sensitivity to any one national market. We've heard that there's a substantial problem in France. We've heard there's a substantial problem in the UK. But I guess as an international carrier, as an IPX carrier, you have the unique advantage that you can bring, the vantage point, should I say, is that you carry calls for all sorts of carriers international. So you therefore have perspectives on a number of different markets. What are you, we've established that there's a significant problem in France, UK. What are you seeing in terms of the impact in other markets in the region, perhaps if you can, specifically in Middle East Africa?
Yeah, so indeed, being at the heart of the international communications, all these matters are quite important for us, and we follow up on these, obviously not with as much detail as, you know, EMEA and what is happening in France, but we do need to follow up on these. And so France and UK are just some of the countries in Europe where we have this issue. There are many other countries that are maybe not as advanced in terms of local regulation, but they are moving forward to some kind of similar regulation at some point. Even the European Commission at some point through BEREC will most probably bring some more unified regulation around this, but okay, these things go quite slowly, so maybe not in the next year or even a couple of years. We see, as you say, a lot of issues in Middle East, less regulated yet than what we have just been discussing here in Europe. We also see issues and concerns around calls or SMSs are a problem because we are talking a lot about calls, but it diverts also into SMS, which is a growing issue in the past months. I would say in the past year or couple of years. It goes both together in parallel, and in Africa there are specific regions in East Africa, West Africa, also in the southern part of the continent that are experiencing specific issues because they are building groupings of countries to establish a kind of, I will quote here, Rome like at home environment like we have in Europe, and they have a lot of issues also with the authentication of calls. The main issue that we are seeing in Middle East is basically, as Amy mentioned, the spoofing of CLIs to, well, spam end users and get to some kind of phishing attack or just some kind of what we call one kitty attack where end users are enticed to call back to very expensive numbers. So these are the kind, so there are different flavors according to the region, but in itself, the authentication issue is I think it's a global problem.
Understood, totally. Okay, let me now turn to you, Philippe, and ask, where is the demand, the drive for a resolution of these problems primarily coming from? And the reason I put it that way is that, the term nuisance is used. And all sorts of agencies, all sorts of parties can sit around and say, yes, it really is a nuisance. But at the end of the day, in order to effect a change, somebody has to own it and drive that change. So I guess I'm asking you, Philippe, in France, or in Orange France for that matter, where is the real drive for change coming? It sounds like it might be from the regulators, but is it from customers? Is it from your own CEO? Is it from business customers who worry about people not picking up calls and losing revenue as a result? Who really is picking up the ball and running really hard with this, as opposed to everybody saying, it's all rather regrettable?
Well, I think there are two, essentially for Orange, and maybe more generally, there are two reasons. The first of which is customer protection. We've got complaints, we need to address them. That's just full stop. The other main driver is compliance with the law. I think at this point, as I said, there's a law that mandates authentication. We still have some time to comply with that, and we will to some extent, to the best extent technically possible. I mean, what is not the driver, however, is networks internal security, if you like. We have a number of mechanisms that rely on the assumption that the calling party number is accurate. For example, there are situations in the mobile networks where when you access your voicemail, for instance, you may rely on the calling party number. The thing is that in the scenarios where you have access to your voicemail and you assert the identity with using the CLI, it is that those are accurate. So it's not an internal driver, if you like. The driver, to your question, the driver is essentially external to Orange, either customer complaints or the law. And on the first one, it's also a matter of flexibility, and it's always, fraud people will tell you that there's always a happy medium, and you can't address 100%. You can't have a zero risk approach, and there are a number of situations where using a number that is different from the sort of nominal number of your access points is legitimate. You have cases where people would like to use the corporate company number as opposed to using the access number. People would like to use the mobile number to assert to use in the contact service, for example. So those are legitimate use cases, and so we have to have we need to find the flexibility between making sure that we don't touch those use cases, but still address the customer complaints and comply with the law.
Right. So, Amy, same question for you in Sky UK. What's who's really picking this up and running with it and driving this to happen?
Yeah, I mean, the regulatory bodies in the UK are very responsive to consumers and what they hear. They've got their ear on the ground. They also, test the players in industry and regularly send us little letters asking us for information around how we're doing and how we're compliant, and we'll use that information not just to catch us out, but also to assess whether what we're doing and what they're enforcing is actually doing the trick, and if things need to change. And it's very obvious that consumers are clamoring loudly about this. I mean, we are expecting an article to come out in a major paper quite soon if it hasn't already. I might not be up to speed the last few days, but we're expecting blow by providers to say, what do we do to protect customers? And to your point, Patrick, around it being called nuisance calls, we are more and more referring to it as scam prevention, because nuisance call, it may be a nuisance at the creation, but actually the impact is a scam. So we're trying to reframe it in a way to make it seem much more serious, and also to help customers understand what they need to do, what they can do to protect themselves, because again, it isn't just a technical solution. As you said, Philippe, there are many valid reasons why we would want to allow certain call types in, customers calling from when they're abroad and wanting to call home, and there's lots of reasons why we would want to be able to make sure our customers stay connected. And it's important to know that in the Ofcom general conditions, there are clauses which will say be compliant here, but only where it doesn't impede on compliance in this area. So there is a lot of complexity, but there are a lot of customer concerns around this, especially during the last few months with everyone being at home. We have seen figures increase, and as you were saying, Philippe, as well, around people will change their MO. It used to be cabinet hacks. It used to be, we had one called Bank of Benefit Streets in the UK, where you'd convince customers, call up and we'll give you a loan if you stay on the phone. We'll give you £1 a minute that you stay on the phone. But then when you get the bill from your provider, you're getting charged £2 a minute for the actual call in the next month's bill. So scammers, if we call them scammers, will always find a way. But I think regulation is moving in the right direction. There isn't a commercial get-out clause in our regulations in this area. It is where there is technical feasibility to do it, you as a communications provider who have the power to do something must take that action.
I think some of the points you've made that they're very well made, and I think we, this community, sat here participating in this event. Certainly those that are in the industry, and more generally, people who are, I guess the point I'm trying to get at is, in the case of elderly people who are subjected to these kinds of calls, they haven't been subjected to a nuisance. A nuisance is a fly buzzing around your kitchen. Elderly people that are on the receiving end of these calls, they haven't had a nuisance. They've had something that's been incredibly upsetting and traumatic and has really rattled them very, very often. So I think it's important to consider it from that point of view. And
I would also, I do have one other point, sorry. So even though we don't have, again, to your point, Philippe, of not having an internal drive for it, there is the reputational damage as well around this. So, you'll have on our corporate network, and I'm sure customers as well will receive calls saying, hi, I'm calling from Sky, I hear you've got a problem with your broadband. And yes, there are going to be vulnerable customers who are more susceptible to believing that than others, but it doesn't reflect well on any of the companies who are spoofed and who are used to mislead customers.
Sure. Let's start looking at solutions a little bit, if I may. And Katia, I'm going to go to you first. Something we've heard from both Sky and from Orange is the difficulty of actually quantifying and calibrating the nature of the problem. What proportion of calls are this type of call? How are they getting through? And therefore that makes it kind of challenging to figure out what the appropriate technical solutions are. So at BICS, because you work with so many customers and because you terminate into North America, I guess you're going to have a particular perspective on the appropriate technical solutions. What have you done in terms of scoping those technical solutions for your own business, and what are you picking up from other customers of yours?
Okay, so the problem is terribly complex, and both Philippe and me have mentioned it, but when you take the international perspective of it, it even becomes a little bit more complex. Because it's extremely difficult to control the actual origin of any call, even if now roaming is quite diminished because of the global situation, but it becomes extremely difficult to control the origins of the call and whether any parameter in the call, also the CLI, the calling number, has been modified, spoofed at any point. So the actual solutions are trying to work with whatever elements the parties have, and I'm talking about operators, I'm talking about carriers, so it becomes quite complicated, and the solutions are even more complicated. I would say at the moment there is no perfect solution. There are too many variables to consider to have an end-to-end solution, and because the international perspective needs also to be considered, that makes it even more difficult. At BICS we have our own solution that, and we try to help our customers. I think most operators, and Philippe and Amy have mentioned they have their own solution also. There are vendors proposing solutions also, but there is and that's my perspective from what I see again in the international arena. There is no perfect solution yet. All operators, all service providers need to develop or need to implement solutions to solve whatever the issue at whatever stage they can. But for me, the complete a full range solution will come whenever we'll be able to coordinate different levels. One is a technical solution, and we need that. Then we need some kind of collaboration in the industry, closest collaboration, and we'll talk about it later probably. And then we need some kind of technical cross-industry solution, and probably we'll also talk about what is happening in the US and North America actually at the moment with still shaken. And for all this to happen, at some point we need regulatory frameworks to be built, because otherwise we will not get the right level of adoption that we need. But it's very complex, but we need to start with the technical solutions that we all need to implement in our premises. That's the step number one.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katia. Philippe, let me ask you to take the sort of technical solution horizon, as it were, and break it down into those measures that you've already taken in terms of implementing a fix, and then those measures that you are considering that you haven't covered yet.
Thanks. Yes, certainly. So in terms of, obviously we're talking about technical solutions here, but even before that, there's a number of things that you can do to make sure that, at least within the contracts, you make sure that our customers only use the numbers that they've been assigned, and that they don't fiddle with the equipment to provide a number of a third party. That's the first thing. That has nothing to do with a technical solution. It has to do with the contracts that we have with our customers, and at least make sure that within our own ecosystem we're just as safe as possible. In terms of technical measures, as I said, there's a number of things that we do, things that have been made public already, so I have no difficulty talking about that. It's filtering. It's making sure that for those calls that we know shouldn't be using a domestic number, just calls from abroad, with a few exceptions that Amy referred to, such as roamers, etc., which are perfectly legitimate use cases. Those are cases where we can say, don't use domestic +33 in our case numbers. So these are the most pretty much simple solutions that we have in place. We also have a combination of analyzing the traffic, for instance, very early machine learning mechanisms that we can apply to detect or associate a likelihood of misuse with the CLI, things we can do of that nature. And obviously, you have that framework that would make it possible to assert the legitimacy of using a calling party number. There was, I think we'll be talking about that in a moment, a mechanism called STIR, adapted in the North American numbering plan in Shaken. We've been involved in the IETF and monitoring this since, I believe it was 2013. I do remember informal conversations since 2010. So it's not a new solution. It's been around for a while, but it's very partial, because the remit of the problem, the scope of the problem, is just that, making sure that the number that you're presented with is presented by someone who has authority over that number. That's a very tiny problem scope. And in terms of network protocol signaling, if you like, it's also very limited at this point. As most of you would know, it's SIP-based. There are adaptations that would have to be made for TDM. None of these are simple, and if you put into the equation the fact that we're not going to upgrade our switches very easily, it makes all these things very complex. So I'm sure we'll be talking about it in a moment. I'd like to come back on one particular point. In designing this solution, it's about the problem. I'm just an engineer, as I'm used to say. When I need to frame the problem, and when I apply a solution, I want to know that the situation I had before the solution is worse than the one I have after I've implemented the solution. That's called metrics. That's called an observatory. To have, we were talking about figures, to make sure that the numbers that we had before the solution are higher than those after the solution has been implemented. And just talking about the NANP, or even the situation that we have here, the problem I have as an engineer is that we don't have those metrics. We don't really know the extent of the problem, and for that reason, we don't know whether the number of calls that are related to CLI spoofing is part of that. We have very general figures, and we don't even know how we can frame the problem scope, if you see what I mean.
Right. Well, that's pretty tough. Is there? I mean, what is the? And I guess this could be a very, very long answer. Let me ask you perhaps something very, very difficult, and give me a very short one. What is the barrier to assembling numbers that are accurate? What are the fundamental issues in getting to those numbers that you need?
I think the main constraint is the way we collect the information from our customers. I mean, in our IT processes, what customers will say is, "I'm annoyed. There's somebody who keeps calling me," and you refer to elderly people being called. I mean, it's horrible. Like 100 calls a night. It's horrid. But then, so it's probably, that one is probably due to the fact that somebody somewhere used their number. But it's in our processes, it's very difficult to collect the information and flag that as number spoofing. We just have a customer complaining about having calls in the night. So there's that part, which is our problem to a large extent. There's collecting the information nationally to sort of figure out what part of the problem we can sort out with STIR, and those that for which STIR will not be a solution. So I think that's all of this, and also making sure that we have the same metric across the operators, and so that in the end the figures that we have are meaningful.
Understood. That's a great answer. Thank you. Amy, Sky in the UK, where are you in terms of fixes applied to date, and thinking about trying to scope the right solution for those fixes that haven't been put in place? Yeah,
I think we're in the same boat as other countries, including France, measuring the issue to actually quantify the success of those measures is very hard. I think the regulator and the communications providers who are part of the different groups and different forums across the UK have gone a long way to gather intelligence, best practice, but as part of best practice, we do share numbers that we've identified hitting our network. We, back to what your point, Katia, which is very valid around SMSs, if we see too many coming in over a 60-second period, you can pretty much tell that isn't going to be, asking someone to come to a party on Saturday night. So we have all sorts of things to filter, to identify, filter, block, stop. I think that there is relative comfort that what we're doing has already mitigated a big extent of the problem, but it's like everything, because we're eliminating something that hasn't already happened. It's hard to know how bad it would have been if we weren't doing these things. I think that there is always more that can be done, but I would definitely concur that it has to be national and then taken up a level to global. This isn't something that one communications provider can fix. It's something that needs to be baked into the behaviours. It needs to be baked into the equipment that we all purchase, which, we all have, not just national standards, but we adhere to global standards. The EEC, European Communications Directive, coming in next year. That there are channels, there are forums, there are regulations that span borders, that cross borders, despite Brexit. So we will find ways to work together, and we need to find ways to work together so that we can make sure that those standards are applied globally.
That's a great answer. I'm just going to make an observation that the comments that you've both made there make me wonder, in terms of the methodology for gathering data here. I think I'm right in saying that the FCC has published enormous numbers relating to the volume of calls that they've seen in the US over the last couple of years. It just makes me wonder, and I'll just leave it for people to think about, that, if we, and this is perhaps where Ibn can help out, if we understand what the methodology of the FCC has used to arrive at the numbers that they've arrived at, maybe we can learn something from their methodology in applying it here in Europe and other countries as well. Just a thought. Let me go now, if I may, to, or do I actually stick with you if I can, Amy, just ask you, Stir Shaken has been mentioned a few times now. It's the solution that's been mandated for introduction in the US and Canada. What thoughts, if any, does Sky UK have about whether or not Stir Shaken is entirely, partially relevant to Sky, or not relevant at all? Or have you maybe not even arrived at that conclusion yet?
I think it's the latter. We haven't arrived at that conclusion yet. I think there needs to be probably a full gap analysis performed of what is already enforced or prescribed, or also already just in practice for best practice across the UK. And as I said, it would have to be something that, it wouldn't be something that Sky could unilaterally decide to do in the UK. It would have to be a national decision, and enforced either through, enforced probably a strong word, but it would have to be adopted at a national level. I mean, Sky is already working towards adherence to the telecom security requirements, and as part of the UK National Cybersecurity Centre. So we consider new protocols, new procedures, and new findings from across the world, as always. And stir shaken will be one of those that is considered and worked on and looked at. But I think it will be only one amongst a lot of solutions that I think are needed. I think that it isn't just about that piece of technology. It is one piece of the puzzle.
Right. Philippe, from what you've said, I rather suspect that there are precious few Europeans who have a comparable understanding, experience, insight into the stir shaken standard. Given your many years of exposure to it, to what extent do you think it could or should be part of the solution in France and elsewhere in Europe?
Thanks. Well, I've referred to the limitations or the actual problem that STIR is intended to solve. Most of you would know that it's a SIP end-to-end solution, so you need signaling end-to-end. It's not applicable to TDM, whereas a large portion of our traffic is still TDM based, or at least has a segment in TDM. So to what Amy just said, it might be, and I'm very cautious, it might be part of the solution. Again, if it's part of the law, it will stop here. We will abide by the law.
Right.
But as an engineer, I think we have to say it can only be part of the solution. I'd like to stress, other than the technical limitations that are referred to by design almost, because it's an IETF standard, translated into an environment, I'd like to stress one thing. I'm a numbering person, and it's very easy to be lured, fooled by a technical solution. STIR can only tell you that the entity that provisions the header has authority over that number. If the numbering policies nationally are broken, if you have policies such that you would assign numbers to people who would normally not get numbers, but you want to be flexible, you want to open the interconnect market to everybody and be as flexible as possible, STIR will not address that. So do not ask a technical solution to fix a problem that is not a technical problem, if you see what I mean. It will do just as much as it can do. So to your question, yes, it might be, it will probably be part of the solution, and I'm hopeful that we will, as an operator, we will also see identified drivers beyond the sort of, regulatory constraints. Drivers such as, I want to use my mobile number as an identity to access to content, for instance. This is a driver that we see in China. I'm active at the ITU, for instance. So I know that the Chinese mobile operators have that sort of use cases as well. So, and that is back to Amy's observation on the need for an international approach on this. So, in a word, this is where we stand at the moment. Yes, maybe part of the problem, certainly not a silver bullet, as we generally say. Thank you.
Understood. Let me ask you, though, a political question, if I may, Philippe, and nobody on these sorts of sessions likes to talk about politics, but it's a factor of life whether we like it or not. The stir shaken is a North American standard. It's been developed by ATIS. It's to use political speak, it is a US controlled standard. Do you believe that is likely to cause some issues with it being adopted lock, stock and barrel in, for example, Europe? Because let's be honest, the relationship between Europe and the US is simply not what it was 5 years ago. Do you think that is that's a potential barrier to adoption of the standard here in Europe?
It really depends on what you refer to. If you refer to STIR, that's the IETF standard. It's quite, except with a few elements that were designed because of requirements from Shaken. With those few exceptions, it is an international standard. It's pretty much applicable to all national environments. However, that application needs to be done. And there are a number of elements in Shaken, not in Stir, but in Shaken, that are developed by ATIS, as you said, that were the result of NANP-specific policies and the environment of interconnection in the US. That wouldn't need to be adapted. That would not be fit for purpose in, for example, the interconnection environment in France. We have, there are things like number pooling, for instance, which are, and the use by enterprises, for instance, which would not be possible in France. So we need to think about, there's a huge amount of work to be done to adapt Stir to the national environment. We have a technical working group in France that has just started that piece of work, and it's a lot of work, and it's not going to happen overnight, really. So Stir, yes, Shaken needs to be adapted.
Interesting. Just one clarification. I think you used the term NANP specific, which is not something I understand, and perhaps others weren't either. Could you just clarify what that means?
North American Numbering Plan.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Not at all. Okay, so I think we're going to conclude now. I'm going to put the same question to Katja by way of a conclusion. So Katja, you have because of BICS's position in the IPX space, you have a somewhat different perspective to what we might expect Sky or Orange to have. Do you have experience of either trialing or implementing Stir Shaken, and if so, what's been your experience, good and bad?
So indeed, we are registered as a carrier in US, so we need to abide by the FCC regulations. So we do need to authenticate calls for part of our business, and we do it. What we are seeing is that, everybody has already mentioned this, but it's just a part of a, more general solution. When we look at the international traffic that we carry, most of it is still TDM. Completely or some portions of it. At some point you get to some TDM infrastructure, and then any Stir solution does not work. It breaks. Right. In addition, roaming traffic is just not considered by Stir. So, it's not even specified how that kind of traffic needs to be tackled. Also, as Philip mentioned, so fraud is a very broad matter, and security threats it's everything very broad, and Stir does provide a solution to a part of it. So it authenticates the origin of the call, but it does not provide a solution for all the other issues that we have when it comes to fraud.
Right.
So it's a partial solution. It's a piece of the puzzle, as we have said, but there are many other pieces that need to be there to find a more generic solution. So we do what we need to do with Stir and the Shaken framework, but even in US, when we look at the volume of robocalls that are still reaching end users, we see that most of it, and a very big most of it, is coming from overseas. And Stir is applicable within US and Canada. So we are not yet there with a with a real solution for the robocalling problem. Again, it's a part of the solution, and it's very good, in my opinion, that we got this kind of solution that is implemented by a big portion of the local carriers, but it will not solve the issue according to me. I mean, we'll see. Maybe I'm a little bit pessimistic, but I do not think it will solve the robocalling issue unless we find a more generic framework that also includes a solution for international traffic.
I cannot think of a better way to conclude this session than with those concluding sentences, Katia. That was absolutely perfect. Amy, Philippe, Katia, I want to thank you so much for sharing as you have with our audience today. Thank you very much for a terrific panel session. And I think I'm going to hand back to Dan now.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I really enjoyed the panel that I was listening in on, and I can't think of a better setup coming off of the comments from Katia as we kind of transition into the kind of the subsequent parts of the agenda. My time here with you is brief. It's I really wanted to set up the stage for the modules to follow and really kind of lay out kind of a big picture top-down view on how I'm looking at the problem, how Ribbon's looking at the problem, and how we're partnered with our customers to solve the problem of identity assurance and really, try to paint the picture or some general constructs of what that means to Ribbon and the generalized architecture that we're driving. So that will jump in. I think we all are aware that, the problem that we're faced with robo and more importantly fraud is very real. I think we've seen some actions in the United States with the FCC trying to put some teeth behind some mandates and to get the carriers to move along the dimension of steer shaken, but also threatening to aggressively go after fraudsters or robocallers. But in actuality, very little has been done. There's been very few cases that have been prosecuted. As you can see from the graphic here, only 62 cases prosecuted between 2006 and 2019. And that it really is a paper tiger, if you will, at the moment here in the United States. But at the same time, it's a very real problem. The estimate of almost $30 billion of lost revenue due to global fraud is a remarkable number. And if you look back at the rate of increase in that number, the rate of increase is actually greater than credit card fraud. So not only is it a large number, it is ramping faster than credit card fraud. And it's a real source of revenue to telecom providers. So where does that leave us? Without really, a strong story from the service providers for identity assurance, trust in a phone call is rapidly eroding. I'm sure I speak for most people on this, on this call that, when your phone rings, if it's not in your contact list, you probably don't answer the call. You'll wait, see if it goes to voicemail, listen, and decide if you want to call back. I mean, that's an incredible erosion of trust and value of a service that's provided to the end consumer by the enterprise, by the service provider. That we just can't afford to happen in our industry. So it's a big problem. It's getting worse, and we've taken some very small steps to start down the path, but we have such a long way to go. When we say identity assurance at Ribbon, it's really underpinned by three foundational pillars. The first is identity, which is, who is the originator? Do they purport to be who they are? Steer Shaken, in a way, attempts to address part of this by allowing a service provider to vouch for a number or a caller that's originating from their network, if you will. But it's only part of the story. Another key element to identity assurance is the reputation. What has that caller been doing on the network? Can they be trusted? Is this somebody I want to talk to? Right? And then lastly, you have to look at what is that caller attempting to do, the context of the call. Are they behaving the way that they have typically behaved in the past? Or are they doing something completely new or considered out of the norm, out of the ordinary or anomalous behavior for a caller that might be indicative that their credentials have been stolen or their service has been stolen and is being used for malicious purposes, right? So when you put all three of these pillars together, this is what constitutes identity assurance, in the context of how we define it at Ribbon. And I think Katya's comments are perfect when you look at this slide and realize that steer shaken it's an element that partially solves identity, but does not address reputation, does not address trust context. And like the previous discussion highlighted, it doesn't, as currently defined, identify all the modalities to be able to certify identity over. Leading example being TDM or circuit switch networks not being covered by steer shaken. So when you hear the term identity assurance, as we kind of move through my next few slides, and more importantly, the more detailed modules to follow, this is how we think about it. And this is how we are constructing an architecture and a solution to move forward to build capabilities along all three of these dimensions at Ribbon. And so if we pivot a little deeper underneath that, so it's okay, so how do you go build that, or what are the elements that start to underpin an architecture, if you will, for identity assurance? The first is obviously network data, and I think there's multiple approaches to kind of call security in the industry. A lot of them focus just on calling numbers. It's very valuable to be able to see calling numbers in real time and be able to assess behavior at that level. But we also think it's very important to be able to assess, monitor, and model behavior kind of at the RTP level, deep into the SIP signaling level, to understand not only where is a service originating from, where is it going to, but also what is it comprised of? How is the service being used? How is it being invoked, right? Simple example, I'm a consumer on my mobile phone. I only make direct calls off my phone, and all of a sudden my phone number starts making two-stage calls. Is that something that's normal? Is that something that can be inferred very easily without having kind of deep network behavior and being in the call path? Not necessarily. Similar argument can be made for things like call forwarding, right? So when we talk about the KPIs and the metadata that we need to observe in the network, it's not just kind of calling numbers, but we really think it's important to be able to look into SIP transactions themselves, be able to look at RTP media attributes, to be able to form an entire network stack view, if you will, of how the service is being used and invoked. And then in terms of policy, we think about it, I tend to think about it at Ribbon, we think about it along three dimensions. There's what I call real, transactional policy. These are more black and white decisions or real-time attestation of a call. Being able to, just based on what I would call fixed policy, decide how do you want to apply call treatment, right? That could be based off of steer shaken, which would have embedded attestation information inside of a call that you can extract and make a decision on the spot. It can be made off of access control lists, known whitelist, blacklist behavior. It can be made or off of different databases that you may have in your network to decide, are these good callers or bad callers, right? But that's kind of what, these are decisions you can make just on the spot based on static behavior, almost like a simple dip, if you will. The second type of policy or behavior is what I call learned policy. This is what you infer or learn from the network. This is being able to model user behavior, model endpoint behavior, model typical network patterns. And then once you have that baseline modeling or behavioral knowledge, if you will, you can then start to flag anomalous behavior against those models, right? Like to my point I made earlier, has this subscriber ever done this before on the network? Has a subscriber used this service in this particular way at this particular time of day in this capacity as part of their, their prior history? That has to be learned in the network because, like we know, all networks are different, and the traffic patterns and the user patterns are different in every service provider network. And this is really where the hard work gets done. And then lastly, we have to recognize that we can't do it all on our own. We have to be able to integrate and federate and bring in data from outside. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So as we start to build up kind of this identity assurance story or approach, if you will, three things that we think are very, very important is first, open APIs. And when we talk about, open APIs, it's really, they have the service or architecture for identity assurance needs to have flexible integration options, both internally with call control and also externally with external sources of data to be able to federate in and bring in other services, databases, or other types of sources of good and bad caller information. We then need analytics. It plays a huge role. Big data analytics is central to being able to model the network and be able to come up with kind of a normative behavior so you can then start to model and flag non-normative behavior. And then from analytics, you start to pivot into things like machine learning, where now you can start to form what I call a digital fingerprint of a user or a device in terms of what's their fingerprint on your network? And is somebody with their credentials or somebody using their credentials with a different fingerprint now on the network? These are all concepts you'll hear about as we go deeper into the modules that follow. But at the end of the day, we really believe that, open ecosystem, big data analytics, ML, and AI are central to the adaptation that has to be built into these solutions for identity assurance. And everything needs to operate at machine speed and web scale. So I think one thing we can all acknowledge here is that no single operator has all of the information. And it's quite likely that a threat that is seen in one network has likely occurred in another network. So part of the identity hub concept you'll hear from some of my colleagues as we go deeper into the summit is this notion of being able to combine or hub information from various sources and be able to broker that back into the carriers. And that's exactly what the essence of our identity hub is to really be able to federate threat information, and we believe that really is the way forward to be able to, holistically begin to address identity assurance. So you'll hear, I think there are well-established methods and procedures for threat sharing, so it can be done securely, whether you're sharing explicit data or you're sharing models to detect bad actors, right? There's multiple layers at which you can federate information between carriers or between networks. And it would be perfectly reasonable to ask, can this be done? Should this be done? This sounds like hard work. We typically don't like to share this type of data. It's very critical to our networks and our consumers, and there's concerns over privacy. My belief is that can absolutely be addressed. I think there are some analogies in other industries that we can look at to see that this can be done. While they're not exactly the same, they are similar. A good example is if you look at the firewall industry, they have standards for federating threat signatures. The standards that exist, STIX and TAXI are the most prevalent standards for sharing detected threats in a network and being able to federate them across networks that the industry and the leading vendors have all adopted so that they can broker and receive threat information as it's detected in disparate networks. So can it be done? Absolutely. Does it need to be done? Absolutely. So I think as we move through this, you'll hear, in these follow-on sessions around our call trust architecture and the identity hub in particular, some key messages are going to be that, the brokering and hubbing of this information from various sources, various networks, whether it's transactional policy that is learned through machine learning or big data analytics, or federated data is all central to building up a strong identity assurance story as we move forward. It's exactly what we're focused on at Ribbon. It's exactly what we're partnering on with our customers to kind of move along or take this journey with them as we start to kind of increase or bring back trust in the phone call on the network. So with that, I will turn back to Dan and let him MC and hand off to the deeper modules. I just want to thank everyone for the time, and hopefully everyone really enjoys and gets a lot out of the more detailed sessions to follow. So thank you.
Kevin, thank you very much. Ram, I've made you the presenter, so you can go ahead and share your screen as well as your webcam when you are ready.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedule to listen to our presentation, and thanks to the panelists for sharing their views here. I took some notes, and some of them were pretty interesting to hear from the different countries and geographies. So my name is Ram Ramanathan. I'm the Senior Director of Product Management here at Ribbon, and I'm responsible for the Call Trust solution. And thanks for Kevin for setting up the big picture. And in the next couple of presentations, we're going to take you into some of the next level of details, kind of peeling the onion a little bit. Okay. Do you see the slide advanced, Dan?
We're good.
Okay, very good. Okay, so I took some notes from the panel session. As I said, it was pretty interesting, and thanks for sharing the comments. And I'll talk through it as we go through the presentation in terms of what are the problems that you're seeing and what are the potential solutions that we have for those problems as Ribbon. And as Kevin mentioned, some of this needs not just a vendor and a carrier, but really cooperation between different carriers and vendors to make this happen, because this is not a single carrier problem or a single vendor solution, but it's really holistic, and we'll get into some of that. So as part of my presentation, let's take a look at the problem, the solution, and some of the problems and areas of interest that were pointed out in the panel session. Just some numbers. So as Kevin mentioned, this is a huge problem, not just in North America, but it's growing into Europe, and we are starting to hear from Asia Pac as well. Just from a numbers perspective, it's a huge problem from a dollars lost to fraud perspective, about 30 billion lost. But more importantly, this is a growing problem as we go forward. There was a 37% growth a couple of years ago, and it's grown significantly since then, is the type of fraud loss that the carriers are leaking in most cases. Carrier talked about Wangiri attacks. We have seen Wangiri attacks in the US increase about 250% recently. And these kinds of attacks come and go, so it's not a static attack that stays for a long time in your network for us to go detect and fix it. So these are fast-moving attacks, and we have seen a significant growth in Wangiri attacks in certain sections of the U.S. Now, if you look internationally, for first in the U.S., it's about, we do about 12 robocalls per person per month, and amounting to about 30 billion robocalls in a year. So that's a huge number. And I think as Katia mentioned, a lot of these calls do come from outside the US. So there are certain things that StirShaken can do. There are certain other solutions to the problems where calls originate from an overseas location. Another number, and this is in South America, in Brazil, it's about 46 calls per person per month. So the problem is even worse in Brazil. If you look at Canada, I'm just trying to give a cross-section of the different geographies here. If you look at Canada, the spam calls have increased 49% year over year from 2019 to 2020. So that's a huge increase. And Canada is going along the path of mandating, at least implementing StirShaken technology in their networks by mid-2021, like the US. Now, if you look at Europe, and this is where I took some notes from Philippe and Amy, is that what we have found is the UK, France, Australia, and Italy, when you look at the cross-section of spam calls, and I'll get into how do we categorize these calls, right? Because we cannot put this robocall into one big bucket and say, oh, there is this one big problem and we got to take care of it. We really need to dissect this problem into different categories, and some robocalls are good calls, so we don't want to take action against that. but we want to take action against bad robocalls, and there are cross sections within the bad robocalls. So when we look at Australia, the UK, Italy, and France, they have a bigger mix of fraud calls. When you put the robocalls in a big bucket, there are telemarketing calls, there are debt collection calls, there are just nuisance annoying calls, and then there are fraud calls. And in these countries, what we have found is that the percentage of fraud calls is a bigger percentage in the overall robocall bucket. Another data point, for example, Chile has a greater percentage of debt collection calls. So fraud is a little lower, but debt collection is a little higher. If you were to go by certain algorithms, AI or ML algorithms, you may classify a debt collection call as a robocall, and you may want to block it. But really, debt collection is legal in most countries, and you're supposed to let those calls go through, even though they may look and feel like a robocall or an annoying call. So Chile has a greater percentage of debt collection calls. So how do we segment this problem into much finer granularity and then take action against it? I think that's what the real problem is. And the panelists kind of hit this across the board into getting into TDM, getting into international calls, getting into holistic carrier-to-carrier solutions. So we'll address those as we go along. Just one final point, with the pandemic as bad as it is, there are people taking advantage of it in different countries. There are different social programs to help people with dealing with COVID in terms of monetary benefits, in terms of other benefits. And the spammers are taking control of these numbers, the government numbers, and spoofing them and making believe that they're really calling on behalf of the government to help in this scenario. So there's a huge spike in the COVID scams. Again, these are seasonal in the sense that it could be COVID that's being taken advantage of. It could be something else next year. So it's a really dynamic problem that we need to adapt to over time. So what we need is an identity assurance solution. And stir shaken is one part of it, but that's not be all end all, as was discussed in the panel. We need to really layer on different solutions that can adapt over time, learn from different things, and take actions. So we need a real holistic identity assurance solution to take care of these issues that we've talked about in the past hour and a half. So let's go into a couple of problems just to understand what we mean by a nuisance or robocall, what we mean by a fraud call, and what are the typical use cases or examples of those. So in this case, there is a network operator, and most of you are carriers and network operators. On the right-hand side, you have the enterprise users and residential users. So let's take a look at a regular good call and how a nuisance call differs from that. So good call is calls from legitimate numbers from owners of those numbers. So people that own the numbers legitimately are making calls either to an enterprise or to a residential subscriber. Those are good calls that go through the operator and then terminate at the enterprise or the end user. Now, there are other calls that may be categorized as robocalls, but they're legal robocalls. And one example could be debt collection. Debt collection are legal robocalls that are made from businesses to end subscribers or enterprises. Then we have the bad calls in the middle, which are basically an actor, a spammer, taking control of a number or spoofing a number. Could be from your own neighborhood to make you believe that it's from somebody that you know. And different countries use the numbering plans differently. But typically, certain neighborhoods are assigned certain numbers, and spoofers use your location information and pick a number to spoof, which is more likely to make you believe that it's coming from a real number. They make calls to end users, they make calls into enterprises and so forth. And this is where stir shaken can detect some of this, not all of this. At least domestically, it can detect that it's a spoof call and take action against it. So this is what we call as a nuisance call, an annoying call, or a robocall. And this is just one example of it. And from an end user perspective, I receive a call, or as an enterprise, Ribbon receives a call. There is no way today to kind of figure out if this is coming from the subscriber number 1 or 2 or 3. Is it a legitimate call? Is it a good call or a bad call? There's no way of knowing that, right? That's the problem statement. Now let's kind of pivot to fraud. So the first was nuisance call, more annoying, not really something bad in the sense that it's not causing any fraud issues or spam issues. Now let's get into the fraud, which is a more serious issue. It looks and feels the same in terms of somebody using a spoof number, or maybe they may be calling from a real number, but they're making a call to take advantage, mostly financial advantage of somebody else. Could be senior citizens, could be regular people, but they're making calls to take advantage of a situation. Same thing, there is an operator in between and there is an enterprise at the end. What the bad guys typically do in this use case is they hack into an enterprise and they put some logic in the call forwarding table saying that if a call comes into this number, forward it to a different number. So obviously the bad guy has to hack into the enterprise to make this happen. And this is a common scenario that we have seen around the globe where legacy PBXs are easily hacked into, and then call forwarding rules are set up, and then the bad guy goes away and he uses those numbers, the enterprise numbers, he advertises those in the black part of the internet or the bad side of the internet. So once that number is advertised, the enterprise numbers are advertised that these are numbers that people can make to call to premium locations, what people end up doing, the bad guys end up doing is they start making calls to these enterprises. The enterprise is going to forward the call to a premium rate number, and now the enterprise is going to get charged for it, saying that you made calls to these premium rate numbers. So this starts with somebody hacking into a PBX, setting call forwarding rules to premium rate numbers or premium rate destinations, and then publishing the enterprise's number on the dark side of the internet. And once you publish that, lots of people look at that and start making calls and taking advantage of the premium rate service at the cost of the enterprise. Now what happens typically is enterprises come to know about this a little later on, maybe at the end of the month when they see the bill, and then they complain to the carrier. In most cases, the carriers eat the cost of this fraud. The enterprises are kind of spared for a bit, and the carriers take the hit for the loss. So this is a common type of fraud that we see in different geographies. And there are different types of fraud: Wangiri attack, one-ring attack, where somebody calls a number and hangs up, and the user, just out of curiosity, calls back, and then it goes to a premium rate number. And the subscriber gets charged for it, but then the subscriber complains to the carrier, and most often than not, the carrier is responsible for eating the cost of the fraud. So there are different types of fraud. It's very seasonal, and it adapts, and it's short-lived. So we need a solution that can detect quickly and take action quickly and adapt to the growing nature of the threats. So what do we need? And this is kind of building on top of what Kevin just mentioned in his big picture is what do we need in a solution to take care of these problems? And the panelists, as they said, there is no one single silver bullet to take care of all these issues. So what should an ideal solution look like? So as Kevin said, there are three pillars that we need to look at from a technical problem perspective: identity, trust context, and reputation. So the first is identity. How do you identify that a caller is really the one that is calling, that is using the number, and is the owner of the number? This is where STIR/SHAKEN helps quite a bit in terms of authenticating who the caller is. And this is right now mostly domestic in nature. This can be implemented fairly well within the national boundaries. Once it goes international, there will be other standards that come up in the future, but at least there is a good handle on this from a national perspective with STIR/SHAKEN. But even before we go to STIR/SHAKEN, there's a lot of low-hanging fruits that we can implement before we do STIR/SHAKEN, which has to be done by all the carriers in the country to make it really meaningful. But there are other low-hanging fruits. We could be looking at static list. Kevin talked about static policy, behavioral policy, and federation, and so forth. But these are static policies that can be set up today in different countries based on commonly known lists out there. There are blacklists that are available in the US from the FCC. There are blacklists available from Ofcom in the UK, and different countries have their own blacklists that they maintain pretty up to date, and we can use that. Again, that is not just the one data point, but that could be used as one of the data points to figure out if a call is a good call or a bad call. In terms of do not originate numbers, and different countries have different policies, but in general there is a list of do not originate numbers where a number is only used for incoming calls, and that number never makes an outgoing call. And if a call is coming from that number, you straight away know that this is a bad call because this number is not supposed to make a call. So the do not originate list is another low-hanging fruit that we can kind of refer to as part of our call processing logic to see if it is a good call or a bad call. A common scam example used pretty frequently in the industry is in the US there is the tax collection agency called the IRS. And the IRS has an incoming number for people to call in and check with the IRS. And that number never makes an outgoing call. And the bad guys took control of that number or spoofed that number and started making outbound calls to unsuspecting subscribers saying that we are calling from the tax department and spamming them and so forth. But with this list, do not originate list, we can right away at the originating entity stop these calls. So, and then there are E164 numbers that are not formatted the right way. And these are commonly available things that we can do even before implementing stir shaken. So that this kind of all of these things refer to the identity of the caller. Is this caller, does this caller own the number that he's supposed to own? The next two metrics are the reputation and the trust context. Reputation is basically, basically obtained from the behavior of a subscriber. And this happens over time. This doesn't happen overnight. It happens over time in terms of understanding the behavior of a subscriber. And here's where we need big data analytics. And towards the end of the presentation, we'll kind of put all this together into a holistic solution. But here's where we need the big data analytics to be sitting in your networks, in the carrier networks, looking at call flows, signaling and media call flows back and forth throughout the network. And as Kevin mentioned, there are use cases. It's not just about calling and call at numbers. Does this subscriber typically call Kenya for 2 hours at a time? Does he typically do that? Is that his behavior? Does this subscriber do two-stage calls, as Kevin mentioned? What about the media? Is it supposed to happen this way? What about his behaviors in terms of volume of calls or the duration of calls? So there are many metrics that a big data system can do over time so that we can create fingerprints for each of the users, whether it's an enterprise or an end user, and then use that as a baseline behavior and look at anomalies beyond that. So we really need a big data analytics system sitting in the carrier networks, looking at all the data that passes back and forth. The third pillar is the trust context, and this is key. And just looking at my notes, Katia kind of talked about roaming traffic. I think Amy touched upon that as well. So when we look at roaming traffic or traffic coming from overseas, and most of at least the robocalls from the US originate outside the US. So when you do see these roaming calls, trust context really helps in determining if a call is supposed to come from a peering connection or from a local domestic access connection. So if a number that typically dials in through the access side of your network suddenly is coming through the peering connection or an international gateway, it raises a flag. Again, it's not something that we use to block the call. This just raises one flag saying that this number typically comes from a local trunk group or a local gateway. Why is it coming from an international trunk group or an international gateway? Is it a roaming subscriber? Has it been registered with a roaming database, right? These are the questions that the system should ask as part of call processing, not just looking at the identity of the user, not just looking at the behavioral patterns, but also looking at where the call is originating from. Is that supposed to originate from that location? So kind of give you the trust context as a third vector into determining if it's a good call or a bad call. And each of these different metrics by themselves alone may not be enough to make a determination of to block the call or send it to voicemail or give a different caller ID indication. But these are flags in the system that build upon one another, and at some point it reaches a threshold where you want to take action. So this is what an ideal identity assurance solution should look like to determine these different metrics and then take action on a call-by-call basis. So what we need is a holistic solution, and this was repeated by all the panelists, is it cannot be one piece that solves one problem for one carrier. This has to be a holistic solution that spans across all problems, TDM, IP, roaming, international, domestic, enterprise, or end users, carrier to carrier, international carriers. It has to apply to all the use cases. And then it should be able to adapt dynamically to the changing threat vectors. Because today we may see Vangueria attacks spiking, today we may see COVID scams spiking, but tomorrow it might be something else. So how does the system keep adapting to those challenges? So we need a solution that is holistic but adaptive as well. So this is where Ribbon Call Trust comes in. So Ribbon Call Trust is a solution. It's not a product. It's a solution that brings together the different aspects, stir shaken. It brings in the in-network analytics to do behavioral analytics. It brings in the cloud aspects, which basically bring in a global view from a threat sharing federation perspective. So Ribbon Call Trust is a holistic solution that brings these different metrics and layers on top of what you have. So you have in your networks devices like session border controllers, gateways, feature servers, IMS network elements. You have different elements in your network. So the Ribbon Call Trust solution builds on top of the existing network elements and then builds layer by layer into analytics, into cloud-based as a service intelligence as well. And we'll talk about that. The first piece of this is stir shaken. Again, stir shaken is great. Stir shaken is great at detecting spoof calling within domestic boundaries, and eventually it'll, at some point we'll get to more international carrier to carrier boundary as well. So in North America, both the US and Canada have mandates for the carriers to implement stir shaken by the middle of next year. And a lot of the carriers are well along the way of implementing stir shaken. It is gaining a lot of traction in Europe and the Middle East. It was initially for calls that terminated from Europe and Middle East into the US, but now we are hearing, as Philippe was saying, there are domestic regulations that are being formulated in France and UK and Saudi Arabia and other countries. So it is starting to happen in other countries. In terms of the Ribbon portfolio, stir shaken is front and center of this Call Trust solution, and we'll talk about that in more detail in upcoming presentations. And we have customers using our solutions today to do stir shaken, but then going beyond that and looking at analytics and global intelligence as well. And the second piece of this, so the first piece we talked about was stir shaken. The second piece of this is analytics. Analytics is really key to this entire solution. It kind of underpins the Call Trust solution in the sense that you need to have intelligence from your local network. You also need global intelligence that I'll talk about in a bit, but you do need intelligence from your local network. And I think it was Philippe that talked about, when we look at this problem, do we understand the whole problem? We say that, I think Philippe said that they initially thought it was 1,700 calls, and that's what it was. And then in the last quarter in 2019, it blew up to about 100 million calls, 100 million robocalls. But what Philippe said was interesting was, are these really robocalls? Are they something else? Are these complaints from customers? So how do we get to the next level of determining what type of call it is, what category of robocall it is? And analytics is key to basically looking at the next level, kind of peeling the onion and going into the next level and looking at what type of call it is. And we need to be sitting in the networks to look at this. You cannot be a cloud-based solution to look at this set of data. You need to be in the call flows, signaling and media call flows, getting data from those devices and making sense of it. And this is where behavioral analytics comes in, artificial intelligence comes in, to look at what the anomalies are, what the baseline behavior is, and what the anomalies are. So analytics is a key piece of the solution. I'm going to be a little quick. I want to give time to some of my other colleagues here that'll get into the next level of details. So what we really need is stir shaken and analytics coming together in an easy to consume as a service format. So because this is an evolving space where threats come today, go tomorrow, and there's a different threat the day after, and so forth. You need a constantly evolving framework, and that's where the Ribbon Call Trust as a service comes in, where this is hosted in the Ribbon cloud, and the intelligence is kind of kept in the cloud with GDPR and privacy concerns taken care of, which we'll talk about in a bit. But really, this is the way we can adapt to the situations by keeping the solution in the cloud, but also using the intelligence that we gather from the local networks. So this is where the Identity Hub comes in, kind of bringing it all together. And if you look at the slide here, we do have all of your network elements, whether it's your call processing elements, your session border controllers, your routing engines. All of these are existing elements, and you could have third-party elements as well. I mean, we're trying to be vendor agnostic, so you can have ribbon elements, you can have non-ribbon elements, but we are trying to layer on top of that with the analytics solution in your network that looks at all the data, makes sense of it, and feeds the metadata into the Identity Hub. So the Identity Hub is the as-a-service ribbon-hosted and managed as-a-service component that takes metadata in a safe and secure and privacy manner from the analytic solutions into the cloud. And it also combines that with global intelligence from other carriers, as Kevin was mentioning. We need a federation concept here. And then from other crowdsourced databases and do not originate lists and blacklists out there. It combines that with the global intelligence, with the local intelligence, and provides reputation scoring on a call-by-call basis. So when a call comes in, we can absolutely do stir shaken, but on top of that, we can use the reputation scores that we determine based on local and global information to come back on a call-by-call basis saying, this looks like a 90% fraud call, or this looks like a 10% robocall, and this could be a telemarketing call. Or this could be it looks like a 50% nuisance call, could be coming from a debt collection agency, and so on. So it gives the next level of detail beyond just the nature of the call or who's calling. It gives the next level of detail so that the carrier can then use that to take action against a call. A high fraud call could be blocked right away. A medium fraud call could be sent to voicemail of a subscriber, and the subscriber, if he's interested, can call back. And if it's a low probability of nuisance call, it can be sent to the subscriber. In some countries, they have caller ID. In the caller ID field, you can say that this is spam likely, spam question mark, and then you can give the calling name in the caller ID field, the display part of the mobile or landline phone. So there are different ways of taking action against each on a call-by-call basis, and the Identity Hub provides the tools and the metrics to the carriers to take action. I'm going to skip this slide because we're going to describe this in detail in the next presentation, but basically the point of the slide is we have built a solution keeping in mind all the privacy and the GDPR regulations of the different countries in terms of data sharing, in terms of data processing agreements, and so forth, and we'll touch upon this in the next presentation. In terms of just bringing it back together, again, we have touched upon different problems, TDM, IP, international, local, roaming, and different types of fraud and so forth that is evolving. So how do we build this infrastructure? So the Identity Hub brings all of this together, starting at the bottom, which is your call processing layer that you have today, which is your IP-based call processing with session border controllers and IMS and gateways. And then on the TDM side with your TDM gateways and soft switches, that is your existing infrastructure. Those are the elements that see the data, the signaling and the media data day in and day out. That's where we get the intelligence from for your own local network. On top of that, we build Stir Shaken, which provides authentication to calling numbers. And then on top of that, we have analytics, which is your in-network analytics that processes the data that your network sees, builds a baseline behavior, and then looks at anomalies on top of that. And this is from your local network perspective. And on top of that, we have the Identity Hub which is a cloud-based, ribbon-hosted, ribbon-managed service that takes the best parts of the local intelligence from the different carriers, and it federates it, and it takes information from the different crowdsourced databases, and it makes sense of the whole thing, both the local intelligence and the global intelligence, and provides reputation scores on a call-by-call basis that your network can then take action against. So this kind of provides a holistic view right from the bottom layer, called processing layer, all the way to the cloud-based analytics layer. With that, I conclude my presentation, and Dan, you want to take over?
Hey everyone, this is Shambhu Rai. Can you see my screen? Dan?
Yep, we can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, hello everybody. This is Shambhu. I'm the product manager for Identity Hub services, and Kevin talked about the big picture, and Ram gave the overview of the ribbon call trust solution and the broad problem space around the nuisance robo calls, which we are addressing with the call trust solution. And Identity Hub is the new offering we announced earlier this month, and I'm gonna take you through and give a view of a little more details on what the Identity Hub services are, and what is the platform we have built, and how we are addressing the problems highlighted by the panelists, Kevin and Ram, around nuisance, telephony fraud, robocalls, and how we can enable it in more cost-effective way. Okay. Okay. Sorry, something got messed up. Okay. So in the Identity Hub, we have broadly two groups of services, and Ram briefly touched on it. The first one is the reputation scoring. And the reputation scoring, what it does is it provides you a score to indicate whether call is a fraud call, nuisance call, a robocall. It can take variety of inputs. It will give you a simple score, right, to prevent nuisance, the Vanguard fraud, and various kinds of frauds, right? Leverages a lot of inputs, a lot of different sources, third-party in network analytics to enhance the scoring accuracy. And in the end, it gives you a simple guidance on what should be the call treatment, whether you want to continue with the call, you want to change anything on that, or you want to terminate the call, right? So that's the scoring service, which takes care of the reputation of the caller, the context of the call, and giving you a prediction on the probability of the call being a fraud robocall. It's a managed service, and it is offered as a SaaS subscription license. Another service is the stress-taking service, and that's the standard and regulatory mandate in the North America. We have stress-taking signing, verification, STICR functionality offered as a service. Very simple method to achieve the regulatory compliance. Everything is hosted and managed by us, so it's really turning out the CapEx into just the OpEx. I'll keep going. So this is the diagram laying out the picture on the Identity Hub managed services. As you can see that the top cloud is the ribbon managed, the Identity Hub platform. It offers stress-taking service, reputation scoring services, but also it has the ability to integrate the other online services, can integrate with third-party CNAM or any other REST-based integration interface you want to query. in real time, right? It also can integrate with a lot of third-party data sources, which you might want to integrate and ingest all this data from in-network analytics, third-party databases, and use that for the scoring of the calls, right? So it's just to hit a few points on the service, right? It's a completely managed. It's a SaaS software, right? The customers would use the service using a ADS82 HTTPS REST API. So customer equipment, it could be even PSX or third-party partner equipment. They will use the REST API to get the reputation score or stir-shaken authentication or verification done using the REST API. Response is what they will use for doing the call treatment, right? So the REST API is the interface. The service is hosted in AWS. It's a multi-tenant service. It's designed for very low latency because the call treatment, the response needs to come. It's in the call path, so it needs to be done in the real time, right? Service is hosted in multiple geographies to ensure low latency. Service is closer to the multiple, the customer geographies. Next, I'm going to hit quickly on Ribbon Identity Hub service. The stir-shaken service, right, out of the two services is really used for the prevent the ID spoofing, right, to ensure the caller is the caller he claims to be. And how it is done is when a call is made, the originating carrier will create the attestation, shine on behalf of the caller to say that caller is attested, I know him, and he's the caller he claims to be, right? So there will be this identity header which will be added by the originating carrier based on the stir-shaken query into stir-shaken service, right? The authentication query. And then that call invite traverses through the SIP networks with the identity header. It reaches the terminating carrier, and terminating carrier would make the verification query into the stir-shaken service, stir-shaken verify to get the identity header validated, whether it's a valid, it has the valid signatures from the originating carrier. Once it is validated, it knows that yes, this is the caller in the from header, and identity header is vouching, and the originating carrier is vouching for its identity. So it's certified caller, and the verified caller ID is presented to the call party. In case if it is not, the certificates are not validated or its ID is spoofed, on the terminating carrier, this verification tab will fail, and then terminating carrier can decide whether he wants to alert the caller, call party, or block the call, or alert him differently, maybe potential spam or route to the voicemail, all those sort of things. But the whole purpose of the stir-shaken framework is really to prevent the ID spoofing, right? So that's the service which is available through Ribbon Identity Hub as a managed service. Both the pieces, signing, verification, as well as certificate repository function, are available for this as a subscription. Okay. Next, I'm going to touch on the reputation scoring services. As Flip and other panelists talked about, right? The stir-shaken is not enough, right? What it does is it just gives you a mechanism for the ID verification, and we need to understand the reputation, the context, and other information to determine if that is if it's a good caller or not, right? So that's where the reputation scoring comes in. In the reputation scoring, the Ribbon differentiation is the complete call trust solution, right? And Ram briefly touched on this. The Identity Hub service is the service which is available and hosted in the cloud. the third-party elements and PSXs makes the reputation request queries in the real time as calls are being made. The call, the prediction or the inference of the call being a bad call or good call is presented as a score along with the guidance for what should be done for the call, and that's happening in the real time. But as this is happening, these components generate the network CDRs, KPIs, and all the analytics information, which is fed into the Ribbon Analytics platform, which further learns the patterns, the pattern being seen in the network, whether it's a Van-Grip fraud happening, behavioral analytics done, and as the patterns are seen, it ingests more fraud insights into and as well as it updates the scoring models, right, to and feeds that back up into Identity Hub. So there is a continuously improving the scoring model as well as the data set for the fraud, right? And Identity Hub complements it with any third-party sources, and then use that for the prediction of the calls, right? So there is a continuous learning, continuous improvement happening here, right? There's a feedback loop which is getting created here, wherein you have a scoring model and the data set which is continuously improving itself based on the performance and experience in the network, right? That's one of the differentiator. There is nobody else is able to offer. With Ribbon, we have the deployments. We are in the network. We have the analytics pieces as well as the prediction Identity Hub service. So we can offer the complete the solution here. Okay. Now I'm going to touch on various inputs Identity Hub can take, right? And how this reputation scoring works. First and foremost, I want to talk about the analytics pieces, right? The Ribbon Analytics. So here you have on the left-hand side the customer network. These are the equipments which will be sitting. These are call processing elements, SBCs, PSXs. It could be third-party applications as well. The Ribbon Analytics ingests the data from these call processing elements, and it will create the fraud insights and information based on the analytics done, and it will feed that information into the Identity Hub, right? And so that is reflective of the fraud or nuisance calls, the way the operator is seeing in its network, right? It's really a snapshot of that, right? Point to note here is that it's just the bad actors list information being shared. It's not a profiling of all the calls or CDRs being pushed up to Identity Hub. It's really a set of minimum, the bad caller information, sorry, telephone numbers. Quite catch that. Could you please? We are making sure it's not really all the data going up or privacy concerns are addressed here, right? The next, we ingest the data from third-party database sources. We have third-party crowdsource, data for the nuisance, for the IRSF frauds. If we can ingest the allow list, denial list, any operator-specific fraud list they may have. So at the tenant level, we can ingest the subscriber data in the preferences. Any regulator list like Ofcom, FCC, they have do not originate numbers, blacklisted numbers. All those things can be ingested. It's designed as a very open platform wherein we can ingest variety of data sources. We can have online queries go out and get the information, right? And on top of that, right, we can query the CNAME or external STIs to get the validations, ID spoofing, caller validations done. And all of this ingested and ultimately fed into a scoring model, which is sort of the brain of the system, right? So so there are two parts, right? One is the data, and another part is the intelligence of the scoring model. So that takes all these inputs and use the intelligent scoring models, ML models, to come out with a decision and the prediction whether the call is a robocall or a fraud call, and give a guidance to the call processing elements and what should be the call validation treatment, whether call should be rejected altogether, it should be forwarded to the voicemail, or it should be subjected to some voice challenge, right? Voice captcha, challenge the user to play some digits, and once he enters, then proceed with the calls or not, right? Or just modify the caller identity and present it to the call party and let him decide what he want to do, right? So there are a lot of things which can be done, but depending on what score the identity hub is coming back with, what guidance it is giving, depending on its a prediction on what is the probability of this call being a bad call, right? It's very adaptable, very open to integrate more data sources. So coming back in here, the whole solution, right? One point I wanted to highlight in here is that this solution is designed to be very open and adaptable, right? Kevin touched on this a little bit. All the third-party databases, online applications, third-party services, it's open APIs. We can work with them. We can integrate those, and it's very adaptable, right? The solution has a concept of the service graph, which can change the applications and services, which can change the various scoring models, and adapt what you want to do on each query, right? It can it has a you can sequence the services, what scoring models you want to use, which data sources, which inputs you want to use. So it's like a service broker controlling the services access there. And then you have the ribbon analytics feeding the data, any other data sources, so feeding the data, which can adapt the scoring models and continuously changing. So as the threat scape changes, it adapts and to mitigate the fraud in the network. Okay. Next, I'm gonna take some time to kind of introduce you to the platform. This is a platform built in using cloud native design for very high performance and scaling. So we have taken into consideration the largest of the networks we should be able to handle in a cluster. It's designed for low latency and real-time scoring of the call. It's hosted in all AWS regions closer to the customer, so that there is a minimal latency. We understand the telecom networks needs 5.9 reliability, so it's designed for the high availability. We leverage the solution. We leverage the AWS frameworks for deploying it across multiple AWS regions. Each cluster is deployed in multiple availability zones, so there is a high level of fault tolerance and high availability built into the solution. Right. To ensure the high availability, we have the service level objectives which we continuously monitor to ensure we are able to meet the service level objectives. We have continuous synthetic monitoring going on in the service. We pump the traffic every minute, and we watch. We are continuously monitoring the results We are testing all the services APIs in here, including the configurations as well as the data APIs, and the results are being monitored 24/7 by the monitoring team to ensure it's meeting the service level objectives. It's not just the failures. We are looking for the availabilities. We are looking for latency and response times, right? If we see anything, any red flags, then the actions will be taken. Okay. We have the next point to cover is the security. As Ram alluded to this, right? It is designed for, it's designed for it is designed with security in mind. With the design paradigms takes care of the AWS well-architected best security practices. We have done the threat modeling, security reviews, and all that. It's encrypted. All external interfaces have the API key-based access. There is no clear text anywhere. We run the vulnerability scans, not just at the instantiation and when the code is built, but even during the operations, we have the scanning going on to ensure any new vulnerabilities which are coming on are discovered by us. We monitor the security metrics, penetration testing. So we are looking at the security to ensure the service is secure and available to the customers, right, at all time. From the operations perspective, we are aligned to ISO 27001 processes, controls. The certification on that is in progress. All the security processes, compliance are in place. We have the access controls in terms of who can access and multi-factor authentications and all that in place to ensure the operations don't get compromised. And we have all those checked there. In terms of the data protection, we have aligned. We have reviewed the GDPR. We have looked at the data protection governance and the limitations of use. Minimizing the data scope or transfer of data out of the EU region. Right? We have the NOC Center, which is based out of the Prague. We are looking at looking at running the data and keeping the cluster information within the geographies and region, right? To conform to these requirements here. Well set policies and frameworks for data retention. Data subject rights, all of that is being worked there. Okay. Now, I'll take a few minutes to talk about some partner applications over here. Given this is, as we highlighted, this is an open framework. Where we want to increase other partners and want to work with other data sources and other applications, right? Just as an example, right? Here we have a partner application who has integrated with Ribbon Identity Hub to implement the subscriber blacklist whitelist implementation, right? They support the CAML, INAP, ISC-based interface. They provide the subscriber interface to add a number in his own subscriber blacklist, whitelist, and using the shortcodes and mobile apps and various other mechanisms, right? And they can push the blacklist information into Identity Hub and then use the scoring APIs to get the consolidated fraud score based on the other fraud vectors as well, right? The network analytics, third-party data sources, as well as the subscriber blacklist, right? Identity Hub can ingest everything and gives a consolidated score for the calls. Right? Another, the example of partner integration is where there is a TDM networks, and this came up earlier in the panel discussion, wherein the question was, how do we do this for the TDM, right? And we have partnered with the SAP vendors, SAP gateways, who implemented the scoring APIs within the system. So on the terminating attempt triggers, they make the query into Identity Hub and get the scoring and call treatment for the call. And based on the response for Identity Hub, they forward the call or modify the calling number, calling name, and alert the caller based on potential fraud or suspect spam, right? Or reject the call, right? So all those are possible. So we have done integration with them and for enabling the reputation scoring in the TDM networks, right? Okay. To sum it up, right? Identity Hub is really a very open platform. It offers the open APIs, flexible configuration parameters to allow integration and customization with customer use cases, right? Analytics is one of the key differentiators for us. We unlike other analytics vendors like Splunk, Govas, who are really more web focused, our differentiation is that we are in the network, we understand the telecom networks and its characteristics, and our analytics is really for the voice calls, right? For the VoIP, right? So we are that's our USP, and we are integrating and feeding that into Identity Hub decision making process in here. It's a comprehensive solution. It takes a lot of inputs, whether it's third-party databases, in-network analytics, online services, and integrates it with the scoring models to come up with the prediction, and it's continuously learning and improving. To address any evolving challenges, right? It's very cost effective because it's offered as an OpEx subscription service, and it's built to scale to address the large scale networks. Right? And I think that's what I wanted to share today. If there are any questions, we can take it up now. It's Dan, over to you.
Welcome back, everyone. I see we've not lost too many people after the break, which is always a danger. I'd like to introduce just very briefly some of the members of the team who will be joining us in the Q&A session today. So we have from the solution architecture team, we have Michael Stovenauer. Michael has been instrumental in both STIR/SHAKEN and Identity Hub solutions and has a lot of experience in deploying ribbon applications around the world. So they'll have a lot of input and knowledge and history from Michael. We have Sean Barrett from the system engineering and architecture team. Sean, again, has been very, very closely involved in the overall development and deployment and selection of AWS for the Identity Hub. And you saw Sean answering a few of the questions during the sessions before the break. So I'm sure any other technical questions, I'm sure Michael and Sean would be more than willing to answer. And we have George Pollett from the security team. And as with all these solutions where information is being shared and where there are interfaces and either personal information being shared from one application to another, or just the fact that there's one call processing element is connecting to another, there'll be lots of questions around how the solution is secured to keep that information confidential and private. And George will be able to explain some of those items and areas during the session today. We also have the product management team who've already been talking on the session today. We have Ram Ranamanthan and Shambhu Rai on the call, and Dan and myself. So that's really going down in the order of, so any questions that come to Dan and I will be the nice easy ones, but we'll rely on the rest of the team for the other questions and answers. So as we begin, are there any immediate questions from the audience, or should we get the ball rolling with a few introductory questions? So maybe if we could begin, maybe Michael, as you're showing your screen too, maybe you could give a little bit of background to how Ribbon came up with the concept for identity assurance.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. As Paul said, I'm the one of the chief field architects for Ribbon. I have the opportunity to go around and talk to many of our customers, primarily tier ones, but also some of the other smaller customers as well, about some of the challenges they've had around robocalling and fraud and kind of combating this this scourge that we're all dealing with. You know, one thing that was consistent across all the customers I've talked to is that, you know, these problems really aren't new. Telephony fraud's been around for a very long time. And the thing that's really changed is the velocity, or how rapidly it's happening. And so, you know, these carriers already have, yourself I'm sure included, already have techniques in your network that you've been using for maybe decades to go after and look for fraud. And, you know, the problem with the systems are, though, they kind of grew over time, and they're separate systems from each other. Some are relatively old, based on older technologies. And so, you know, what I really saw as a need was a single holistic platform that could bring in all the different techniques that we've learned in the past, but allow them to be brought together under one enforcement function. And this is really kind of where the identity hub concept came from. And then on top of that, there was this urgent demand to make these systems react faster, to allow data ingestion to occur faster, and really to modernize and bring web scale, if you will, to these systems that we've been using for quite a while. And then the underpinning of the whole system needed to be based on analytics, and really kind of machine learning and artificial intelligence concepts needed to be brought into it. And, you know, a lot of the people I talked to believed that was the only way we were going to be able to react fast enough. And so that's, you know, those two things, combining all of the different techniques together in one enforcement function, and then reacting faster with analytics functions, are really kind of the two main drivers for the platform.
Great, thank you, Michael. I'll just pause. Lance, do we have any questions or any raised hands from the audience yet?
Hey, Paul. No, nothing yet from the audience who's raised their hands. Please feel free to do that.
We'll keep going. We'll get more controversial as we go on, and hopefully stimulate a few questions. So, Sean, maybe not to have Michael on the spot all the time. Yes,
Paul. There was a question that came in earlier during the presentation, and maybe I'll just read it out, so and then we'll decide whose best answer is. And I think Shambhu partially answered this as well, but maybe there's more interest in the answer, which is, how do you address the TDM-based nuisance call? So I know Shambhu showed that at the very end, but maybe we can engage in that conversation as well.
Sure.
So I'm not sure who wants to take that. Michael, you want to start and maybe hand it off? Michael, there you go.
Yeah, I can do that. You know, there's kind of two aspects to that. One is, does the nuisance call originate on the TDM network, or are you concerned about calls that are terminating on the TDM network? And what we've really seen is a lot of these nuisance calls are originating in the SIP domain. And I think on the TDM side, they're a little easier to track down, and so they're kind of harder to perpetrate on that side, because TDM connections are fundamentally static in nature. They have longer provisioning times, and so you have a better relationship, I think, with the customer when you have a TDM trunk, at least on the subscriber side, right, or the enterprise side, where you're the originating carrier that's connecting these TDM trunks. But on the terminating side, it's a very different story, right? So, you know, there's still lots of TDM interconnect across the world, and TDM terminations. And so if this stuff originates in SIP and leaks into the TDM network by then, it's very difficult to control and stop. So, you know, the architecture that Shambhu went through really was focused around, what do we do on the terminating side? So how do I engage a TDM switch on the terminating side and allow it to make decisions and really allow it to help the receiver of that call make decisions about what they want to do with the call. Do they want to divert the calls? Do they want to, do they just want to know, right? Do they want the display name updated? And so I think the infrastructure that we're building around Identity Hub can be easily leveraged by the TDM network. And we think it can be done without a lot or maybe any software investment on the TDM side as well, just using existing things like AIN-based triggers.
Great, thanks. Paul, back to you.
That's great, thank you, Dan. So maybe then, Sean, I know Shambhu mentioned earlier on and Ram about the solution being implemented in AWS. Could you give us just a quick overview of why we chose AWS to host this rather than hosting it in our own environment or in another type of public cloud?
So there are a few reasons. I am Sean Barrett, principal architect at Ribbon. A couple of reasons. So the first is for this type of problem, it really only helps if you can take action on the call, right? Which means that you need to essentially be in the call processing path, and that introduces a lot of the real-time performance requirements, resiliency requirements, and scalability requirements. And for those kinds of applications, AWS really is at the forefront in terms of offering services along the lines of serverless compute and lightweight containers with automatic scaling that really enables that. That really enables this automatic scaling, so you can dynamically scale up and down just based on the current load and the current request rate. They also have a quite superior architecture in terms of fault tolerance, where you now have fault tolerance at two different levels. So you have it at the availability zone level, so that within a region you have fault tolerance across multiple data centers within a region. And then for the really catastrophic stuff where you lose an entire region, to then have resiliency one level up, pushing it across regions. So that gives you, the truly dynamic auto scaling and fault tolerance that you really need for an application service like this that's tied into your call processing path. The other big reason is, again, some related to the fact that it's in the call processing path, some related to the fact that there are likely to be, various compliance and especially PII restrictions, is that AWS offers regions across the world. And that allows us to then replicate this service in whatever geographies are needed, both from a latency perspective and from a data compliance perspective. So they're also at the forefront in terms of the variety and areas of the world that they have local regions that facilitate this. So putting all of these things together is how we ended up managing this within AWS versus other alternatives.
And I guess, well, Sean, using AWS means we can locate this close to the service providers taking the service. So with AWS instances around the globe, we're not dependent upon an AWS data center or another data center in just the US or just in Western Europe. This truly can be a global service.
Correct. Yes, that's what I was hinting at in terms of the, AWS having regions around the world, and in particular for EMEA, the European regions to have the data physically located, within the Eurozone.
Yes. So Dan's just noted that do have a question from somebody in the audience around the learning capability, the machine learning capabilities of Identity Hub. and how this understands specifically any third-party equipment that would be in the service provider network.
So when we're talking about that, we're talking about, there are different aspects of it, right? So there's stuff that we learn or can learn and train models based on the totality of data that the Identity Hub is seeing across across many different tenants, right? So there's that level of learning. But there's another aspect of this which is part of kind of our overall call trust solution, and I'm sure Michael will weigh in on this as well, which is our solution is not just the Identity Hub. Our solution includes analytics, and we have an analytics product which sits on-prem and handles, data analysis and learning there, where the insights from that learning then get fed up into Identity Hub. So in some sense, that allows us to do the best of both worlds, in the sense that it has access to data that is only available on-prem for, commercial and legal reasons, but at the same time, making the information that is, that is available there in anonymized or genericized form up to the Identity Hub. So it's kind of the combination of the two. First, being able to see across tenants in the Identity Hub space, and then also being able to leverage learnings from directly on-prem through our Ribbon Analytics product, which sits on-prem and has access to on-prem data. Michael, I don't know if you want to add anything more on that.
Well, I might just add the one more piece that was in the question, which was about third parties, right, and how we can leverage that information. And really, that analytics platform was designed from day one to be able to bring in not just Ribbon hosted equipment, but we can bring in data from any source, really. So being able to bring in signaling or call detail records from third parties is a big part of that analytics platform. But the design really was set up to collect the data as locally as possible, and that's for a number of reasons, including performance and latency, but also data protection laws, and then process it locally, and then provide what we call signals, or I like to call them the bad guy lists, right, up to Identity Hub. So, even if you're sitting in a private tenant in AWS with your own hosted instance, the data that's being shared even in the AWS can be anonymized, and also, can be only the list of data that you want to act upon, and not all of the other data that you really want to protect. So that's a key part of the analytics piece. So bringing in third-party data from signaling or call detail records from any third party is a foundational piece, and then processing it locally and only sending up the potentially anonymized data.
So effectively, Michael, the analytics is the interface point to any third-party elements, and it parses that information into a format that Identity Hub can then consume.
That's exactly right. Yeah, you can think of Identity Hub as kind of a very advanced model-based enforcer, where it can combine information from multiple different processes, whether they're static lists of the does not originate lists that Shambhu had talked about, or other fraud systems, or lists that are coming off of our analytics platform as well, right? That's kind of what Identity Hub is doing. But then you need this AI and ML-based system that's actually looking at the raw data, that's looking at all of the information on the network to come up with those lists of inputs for the enforcement function.
And there was a follow-on question related to the information that Identity Hub collects. What information is it collecting? Is it an entire call detail record?
Identity Hub itself is not collecting that kind of information. So there's an API that we have, which we call the scoring API, which we can make available to our customers, of course, and you can look to see the information that is being shared across that API. But for right now, it's mostly the information around originating and terminating, party A, party B numbers, maybe diversion numbers, and this thing we call identity context or trust context, which is a bit of information which tells you basically where that call originated in that network. So those are the pieces that are being shared right now with Identity Hub. And Linux, on the other hand, being on-prem, has access to anything you give it, so it could have a much richer data source.
And in terms of the overall information being shared and being shared from the service provider into Identity Hub, that's sort of the key information Identity Hub needs to learn patterns and look for, or to be able to provide reputation scoring. And I know when we've presented this and talked to all the customers in the EMEA region about this, one of their key questions is really being concerned that they don't breach any GDPR laws and regulations. I think, George, this is an area you've been looking at for privacy.
Yeah, hi there, it's George Hollett. I'm the leader of the Ribbon Data Protection Program, focusing on things like GDPR and other data protection regulations that are applicable around the world. Yeah, so in terms of GDPR, if you think about how this solution fits in, it's effectively a cloud-based data processor using GDPR speak. There's different accountability levels. There's data controllers, data processors. This solution is basically a data processor type solution, whereby the customer would be effectively the higher up on the data food chain, would be the closer to the controller, if not the controller. So in terms of when we look at compliance, the folks in the call, like Michael and Sean, mentioned that the data for many technical reasons needs to remain in region, and AWS offers us a lot of flexibility to keep the data in region, which is a really good data protection attribute to the solution that lends itself to managing the compliance situation there. The AWS security model, of course, combined with ribbon controls, provides a good basis, a good standardized basis for security, a good operational security posture, if you will. What we're planning to do here at Ribbon is expand our pre-existing ISO 27000 program and ISMS to cover the operations, the Ribbon operations, and around this particular solution as well. In terms of other things that are other attributes around GDPR compliance, I mentioned data processors. So there's requirements under the GDPR to under Article 28 specifically around data processor obligations. So certainly Ribbon more broadly is very familiar with those obligations, and typically those find their way into contractual obligations through a data processing agreement. Any other questions?
So we'll pause for a moment to see if there are questions from the attendees. I know GDPR is often a key question that's asked when we do talk about the idea of sharing information. So if there are no questions yet from the audience, you mentioned, George, that, and Sean also mentioned that being able to run in AWS means we can keep the data local to a region. But when we're analyzing information, is it sometimes a benefit to be able to analyze information collected globally to spot trends? For example, certain types of fraud may follow the sun or may move from one region to another as they're detected.
Yes, there are different levels of models that you can build, but the thing to realize is that depending on what you're looking for, it's not necessarily required that you use the original data. In many cases, you can use anonymized versions of it and anonymize to the level that it meets GDPR compliance. So that's one method here where you use anonymized data. There are other methods where you never move the original data, but you take insights that you learn from the data within region, and then it's only the insights that you combine together. So there are different techniques where you can meet both the letter and the spirit of the data privacy laws, but still end up with models that work globally and more generically.
Great, thank you, Sean. So we've talked about the availability in AWS. We've talked about the real-time response for each call. In terms of the overall resilience, I guess some of the, again, a common question asked by service providers, what if in the worst case, there is a break in connectivity from the customer's own network into AWS? Are calls no longer able to proceed because they're not unable to get a reputation score?
So that depends on the client. Certainly our PSX clients, you have a variety of configuration knobs where depending on which kind of failure you can continue, not continue, you have kind of full control over that. I will say that, you know, there's resiliency and fault tolerance on both our side. There should also be resilience and fault tolerance on the service provider's connection to AWS. They would not typically be, you know, connected to only a single AZ. You would use redundant connections, just like you have redundant network connections to anything. But even in the face of, you know, complete loss of connectivity due to, you know, whatever, complete data center outage or something like that, the clients, you can continue with the call. Certainly with our PSX, you're able to configure it for it to continue, and you don't get, for example, a reputation score on the call, but the call will terminate properly.
Great, thank you, Sean. And you mentioned earlier on there was a session during the PLM presentation, I think during Shambu's presentation, asking about how the interface between the service provider and Identity Hub is secured. I think you answered that on the session, but perhaps just repeating that for people who maybe missed the answer on the chat session.
Right. So we have two different models, and it really depends on the service provider. Like many web services, we absolutely offer, you know, kind of a direct HTTPS REST-based interface. It is accessible publicly, so if your network can reach public IPs, you know, that would be certainly one way to go. It's not, the service is not open, you know, out to the entire world. It is whitelisted, you know, by your IP address ranges, so only you would be able to access it. But that's one means of connectivity. Another means of connectivity is some service providers, certainly most of the middle and large service providers, they already have direct connects into AWS for other workloads that they run in there. So they have, you know, dual or, you know, otherwise redundant direct connections into an AWS VPC. And so for those kinds of customers, they typically would prefer to reuse that. And we do also offer the service as a private endpoint service within AWS, so that allows them to define a VPC endpoint within their VPC and then to reach our service through that. So in that path, their traffic, you know, never leaves, never goes on the internet. It goes direct connect into their VPC and then directly within AWS through a private connection to our service and back. So those are the two main models.
And just to add on to that, right? Question was also asking about the encryption, right? So all external interfaces are really encrypted. They are secure, right? So It's all HTTPS. We don't have anything unencrypted between PSX or Identity Hub and Identity Hub.
Yes, so to try and, in terms of the audience, I know we've talked a lot about the information being shared from the service provider network and hopefully reassured people that that information isn't breaching any confidentiality or privacy regulations, and I guess it can be adapted to different countries. Is there anybody in the audience who'd like to sort of who has an opinion whether it's a good thing to share this information or a bad thing, something that might meet resistance within your organization to set up such a connection to share information with a third party? Just see if we get any hands raised at that point.
Paul, we do have a hand raised by Mark Ashworth. I've unmuted you, Mark. If you would, there you go. I think you're unmuted now, so feel free to respond.
Thank you. Yeah, I just I noted in the presentation that there seemed to be a good degree of flexibility in the way that the solution modeled and scored and so on. I just wondered if you could comment a little on the degree to which customization would be applied in applying the solution to each individual operator's network versus being able to, at least to start with, make use of common rules and models that could be reused.
Okay, so let me take the first pass at that, and then I'm sure Michael will want to add to it. So there's customization at at multiple levels here. The first is in terms of what numbers go into various lists, right? So there are allow lists, deny lists, DNO lists, various kinds of lists. And then on a per tenant basis, you get to populate those lists. So there's customization in terms of, well, this is the set of numbers that you consider bad, or that your on-prem fraud detection systems have previously identified as bad, that you want to put in these lists that we access and access. These are all tenant specific, and so we access these lists. Your data only as part of processing your request. So that's one level of customization. The next level of customization is the model itself, right? When you have something that shows up in list A and something that doesn't show up in list B and something that shows up in list C, how do you want to weight the information that it is in list A and not in list C, et cetera, right? So we certainly provide default models based on our global learnings, but that weighting and how you combine those and effectively what level of importance you give to these various things, that is also customizable on a per tenant basis. So it's customizations at multiple levels, what numbers you put in the list. What I didn't mention is even which lists you use. That's also on a per tenant basis. And then what's the relative importance of the different subsets of information you might have. That's also customizable on a per tenant basis. Does that answer the question?
Great. Yes, that's helpful. Thank you.
Right. So just to add on to what Sean was saying, there is a lot of flexibility, but we will have the standard offer which will be available for you to take it and use it, and then if you want to customize, you can customize it further, right? So there are both the options.
Okay. Someone asked a question on the chat that I'll take, and other people can join in if you want. What is the deployment model used in North America in deploying STIR/SHAKEN? Is it centrally managed identity hub in place, which is queried by all operators to verify the signatures and profile scores? Okay, So the first thing is that STIR/SHAKEN is not separate. It's part of the Identity Hub. So the way the Identity Hub is structured, and Shambhu mentioned this, is that it provides a service brokering function, of which STIR/SHAKEN is just one of the services that you can add to your service graph that you say you want your requests to, to invoke this service. In terms of, so, if your service graph has to do, STIR/SHAKEN verification, then we will take the data that's presented in there from the identity header information and validate it and include reverse that information that goes back to you. So in that sense, that service is global and can be used by anybody who subscribes to the Identity Hub service. In terms of parts that are not global, on the signing side, every carrier has their own, certificates, obviously, and so there is still per tenant configuration associated with, with your signing characteristics. We support, multiple signing profiles, and so based on, where in your network your request is going from or things like that, you can choose which particular signing profile to use, which will then govern, which signing key gets used, what level of attestation, et cetera, et cetera. So, in short, STIR/SHAKEN is just another service within the Identity Hub framework and infrastructure.
And to add on to what Sean explained, right, in terms of how service operates, and this physically gets deployed in, multiple clusters and will have one or many clusters, right, in different regions, right, to ensure the proximity with the customer. So it's not just one cluster deployed which is being used by everybody. There are multiple clusters in different regions to ensure there is a high availability and fault tolerance and all that.
If I can just add one more point, I want to make sure we're clear on the way the question was asked, because there's actually two parts. So everything that was just explained is how one or more network operators in the U.S. and North America can access Ribbon's Identity Hub service. But part of this question was, what is the deployment model? Is there a centrally managed solution that every operator will use? While Ribbon would love to be in that position, there is no central database that is being used the way we're describing Identity Hub and the capabilities. There are certainly, and Michael, you can go into more detail than I think anyone here, there are certainly certificate authorities and information that's being shared at the national level so that STIR/SHAKEN can work. But I want to make sure we're clear that that's different or a separate relationship than someone using Ribbon services, just to be clear on that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dan. I mean, the system is really set up for, if we're specifically talking about STIR/SHAKEN, right? So nationally, we have certificate authorities which are authorized by a government-backed organization to provide signatures for telephone calls, or at least to provide signing and certificates for them. But the actual signing process and the verification process, the cryptography, if you will, that happens on a per call basis, that's widely distributed. There's a number of vendors that offer the solutions, and you can have, even from Ribbon, you can have both on-prem and hosted. So the on-prem version would be separate dedicated systems, maybe running a Kubernetes cluster or a type of clustering system to do that with. Whereas the on-prem, the cloud hosted would be part of the Identity Hub workflow that Sean and Shambhu talked about. Yeah, again, no single national component to this though, other than the authorization to sign. is globally or at least nationally controlled.
Yes, I think there are discussions ongoing, at least in the UK, with the UK regulator, and in France, I believe, from other discussions with Philippe. I presume other countries are probably looking at STIR/SHAKEN and looking at the impact it's had and if it can be applied to home markets. I guess if we look across the EMEA region, there's lots and lots of cross-border calls made, particularly in business, and can also be the source of lots of Wangiri fraud or other types of fraudulent calls as well. So it would require some degree of cooperation between all the service providers to get something as thorough as STIR/SHAKEN off the ground, whereas identity assurance doesn't rely upon STIR/SHAKEN. It can take information, do analytics on the calling patterns across the network and still provide the value of blocking, or preventing a lot of nuisance calls and highlighting fraudulent calls. Just going back to Mark's question as well, in terms of customization of Identity Hub for a service provider, I guess many are maintaining their own lists of maybe nuisance numbers or do not originate numbers that should never make a call outbound. Can they also be integrated in the same way that, say, NomoRobo databases can be implemented into or integrated with Identity Hub?
Yeah, I mean, the system was absolutely designed to have two levels. So we have system-wide lists or system-wide data sources, I call them, and then you also have tenant-specific data sources. So yes, we can aggregate into a system-wide data source. And then the system-wide data sources are not necessarily used by every tenant. So each tenant's workflow will decide which system-wide data sources they want to use. In fact, we really think this system will evolve eventually to federation, and I know Kevin talked about this a little bit from the firewall vendor community, how they've handled this. We really think these system-wide data sources will become a federated source, even where one carrier who may see a lot more traffic than other carriers might be willing and says, okay, I will allow you to federate this part of this information that's been uniquely gathered out of my network and anonymized appropriately, so that it complies with laws, but then allow that to be a system-wide data source. So there's kind of these two tiers, if you will. There's the system-wide data sources and the tenant-specific data sources for that.
Okay, thank you, Michael.
Sure.
And then Shambhu, in terms of I know we talked about the services as STIR/SHAKEN as a service and the reputation scoring as a service. Within reputation scoring, both you and Ram talked about several different types of either fraudulent call or nuisance call that can be identified. If somebody's subscribing to reputation scoring, are they subscribing to a whole block of services, or is it sort of an a la carte menu they can pick and choose from?
So good question. So there are subscription options for different use cases, right? So if you are looking for a fraud score or just a nuisance score, or both, right? So there are a la carte subscription options you can choose from within the fraud scoring itself. If you're looking at just the Ribbon provided data sources and the global list and the scoring based on that, or there are a lot of customer data sources you want to use, whether the subscriber lists or the tenant supply data and network analytics. There are kind of different subscription options for the kind of level of subscription service you're looking for. So it's very flexible. Yeah. And how the system works is it's again we monitor the usage and you are allowed to go above what you have committed to purchase, right, as a monthly usage amount. And if there are any overages, those will be trued up at the end of the month. So it gives the flexibility in terms of with your subscription options as well as the true up as your traffic varies, right? We can true up based on the actuals.
That's great. Thank you, Shambhu. And in terms of the US market and the situation for service providers originating calls or delivering calls into the US market, are there obligations where they are they're bound by the FCC regulations to include an identity header in the calls they're putting into the network? So really, would a service provider who's operating in EMEA have to look at implementing stir shaken on some of their interconnects into the US?
Right. So the FCC, the mandate is for the mid next year, the SIP based interconnections need to support this. For the TDM, there is a extension for a couple of more years, but even there, they have mandated that the operators need to implement some robo mitigation, nuisance fraud mitigation mechanism like reputation scoring to get that extension essentially.
Yeah, but Paul, as far as I know, I don't think that the FCC has come out and said that international carriers terminating into the U.S. have to sign their calls, if that was your question directly.
That was part of the question. It was partly looking at, is there maybe it was some anecdotal discussions around some service providers preferring to have some form of identity header on any call originating into the network, even if it really didn't validate an attestation level of A or B, but just something to show that it had been looked at and considered, and somebody was vouching for it somewhere.
Well, right. So this gets into the shaken part of stir shaken, right? But in the shaken architecture, there's this notion of a gateway attestation. And so, one of the things that these signatures provide, in addition to maybe helping you with understanding whether the person had control of that number, legal authority over that number, just to actually place the call, you can also use it for traceback, right? So it can be very important around traceback pieces. But this could be the U.S. carrier doing that. So the U.S. carrier receiving that call from the international partner could put a gateway attestation on it, which basically just says, okay, this is the point where it entered the U.S. And so for traceback, then they know, which carrier, international carrier, to go back and talk to if they're having problems with it.
Right. The international end-to-end stir shaken is still not really, it's a little far off, right? There are no dates around that.
Yeah. Okay. So looking, I don't see any additional hands raised from the audience.
So Paul, there was a question that came in. So it says, I'll read it out. It says, from listening to Philippe and the issues he raised about addressing whether stir and shaken are adaptable or adoptable, if you will, in other countries, that it's only the shaken part which is unique to Addis. He said there would be very little adaptation on the stir side. So that suggests that adoption in other countries outside of the US and Canada may be less problematic than perhaps they first thought. And they're asking, do we agree with that presumption? So probably Michael chime in.
Maybe if I could add to that, maybe for Michael and Sean, one of the points can be how particular headers are used within different networks. For example, whether the P-asserted ID is generated by the service provider or by the originating PBX or subscriber. So even though the stir shaken might be used, stir might be used and the identity headers are used, the parameters they apply to might be different. And the question is, how flexible is our solution to adapt to that?
Yeah, so and there's kind of two answers to this. There's a technical answer, and then there's regulatory or legal answers. I'm not sure I'm prepared to answer the second part, but on the technical side, right? Stir is really all about how you build this thing we call the JWT, and it's the claim, if you will, and how and stir defines the identity header and what goes in it. Although it leaves a lot of flexibility to add things right, to that header, additional claims, if you will, right? But they talk about originating and terminating numbers, party AB numbers, and a thing called an IET, which tells you when the signature was generated, right? So all of that infrastructure, we do think will be easy to apply around the world if the different regulatory bodies choose to take it up. The shaken part is really relatively minor. In fact, that RFC is very, very short. It's only a couple pages, really, of true detail, and it really just defines this attestation level, this ABC attestation level. So, I think if other regions of the world were to take up shaken and apply it, but maybe do the attestation components a little differently, I don't think that would be problematic at all for Ribbon to ingest that. I mean, we've really created a flexible system, if you will, around what we can specify for the attestation levels and what we can do with what we call CBT or call validation. So once we get a signature validation back, then based on the different levels in shaken, we can then say, okay, I update the display name, or I take other actions based on those. Those can be easily extended. So if attestation is different in France than it is in the U.S., I think that would not be terribly hard to adapt.
Thanks, Michael. And one of the big concerns service providers had, though, again, that we've spoken to, is the concern over too many false positives. So the concern about potentially blocking calls that aren't really nuisance calls. I know we did some trials with the analytics application where we were identifying, I believe it was calls from an Amazon help desk as potential Wangiri fraud. So one of the concerns is how quickly would we be able to react to false positives, or to try and avoid too many false positives?
Yeah, I think that really comes down to the analytics component, right? Which is, I'm sure, what you were trialing there, or showcasing for that particular case. A lot of the techniques that have been employed across the world right now for fraud detection are, really what I call data mining, or, Sean's got better terms for this stuff, but they're not necessarily ML-based or AI-based systems, right? I think as we get into more ML-based pieces, especially if we can get, as we get to kind of the ultimate end goal, which is self-training systems, we can start to adapt quicker, right? But in the end, it really comes down to these systems, just like a human being, right? If you put a human down and said, hey, pick out the CDRs that are bad, right? In the end, that human needs feedback. That human needs someone to tell them, hey, you made the wrong choice here, right? And that's really, that's one of the wide areas of study right now, is how do we provide that feedback? How do we, in data science, it's called labeling, right? How do I label these events as good or bad, or, or correctly identified or incorrectly identified events? And that's really the key to that kind of a piece, is to get better at labeling the data and providing the feedback.
So one point I want to add to that is that, yes, there's a piece of which, we can modify our behavior based on our learning and different ways of getting feedback and learning about this. But the other point that I want to bring out is that the service provider that is using our service, they're not just totally at our mercy waiting for us to figure it out and to change it. They have access in order to add their own tenant-specific list to say that, okay, this set of numbers you've been flagging bad, and we want to reduce the risk associated with these, and we'll upload these numbers, and then that adjusts the future scoring associated with those numbers. So in terms of correcting false positives, it can happen at multiple levels, and it was very important for us to make sure that the tenant, the customer themselves, have a lot of control, just by themselves, based on the peculiarities of their network, or the speed at which they detect false positives or true positives, and so they can make these adjustments on the fly, even without our involvement.
Great. Thank you, Sean and Michael. And just one final question maybe I have is on the, Michael mentioned about the machine learning capabilities, the artificial intelligence. Is that one of the advantages of being implementing the solution in AWS, is that we get to use a lot of the toolkit available in AWS?
Yes, that is certainly an advantage. I wouldn't say that was the primary driving force. You do have ML frameworks in a lot of environments, but yeah, that is an advantage, but not the overwhelming advantage. From an architectural perspective, the overwhelming advantage was they're really quite sophisticated on the services that allow you to truly do dynamic scaling and multi-level, multi-level fault tolerance, which is really important for delay-sensitive and jitter-sensitive applications like this.
Okay. Thank you, Sean. So are there any further questions from the audience? I've been looking at the Q&A, Dan. I think we're sort of run dry on questions at this point.
Well, that's fine. I mean, I think we've had a pretty full summit. We might actually wrap this up a little bit earlier. David, can we bring you back in and do a wrap up?
And most certainly can. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can, David. Just before you do, can we just give a thank you to Michael and Shambu and George and Sean for being willing to be put on the spot for my long list of questions. I'm always trying to ask them anyway.
Yes, thank you.
Indeed, they're on my list of thank yous, but no, very good. You've done it. So thank you, Paul, Dan, and team. And now we're sadly out of questions. I'm sure I'm not alone that we've learned a lot from today's session, and from both the service providers that have participated in the session as well as the ribbon presentations, and I'm very appreciative to learn from your shared experience on the identity assurance across EMEA. As Patrick, Philip, Amy and Katia clearly identified during the panel, the nuisance and the fraud calls are a real problem today, and unless as an industry we have a solution across national borders, then we will not have solved the problem, which is undermining consumer trust in the calls they receive, as well as the ability of the service providers to address this. The Ribbon Call Trust portfolio, we believe, is a key part of the solution for today, for the real-time discovery of the reputation of the caller. As it's been presented by Kevin in the big picture, Identity Hub leverages advanced analytics capabilities to determine both the caller's intent and the context of the call to quickly allow you, the service provider, to make call routing decisions, which ultimately help your customers restore that trust in the calls they receive are legitimate. Ribbon has built Identity Hub framework to solve that bigger picture problem, where in the future we envisage facilitating federation between service providers and international organizations, maybe as I3 Forum, and adapt to taking maybe third-party data such as blacklisting, whether from regulators or from other organizations to solve that international problem. The issues mentioned are very dynamic, as we noticed with the various flavors of fraud attacks discussed, and there's no single answer. We have seen the value of stir shaken, but it's only part of the answer. Call Trust is a solution that goes beyond identity validation, and as you've heard, includes context and reputation scoring. We believe that Ribbon has the technology, as I said earlier, and global industry knowledge to be your trusted partner and solve this major challenge in our industry. We have experts in region and around the world. If you haven't already been contacted, I encourage you to contact your account manager to set up a further discussion of how we can help restoring trust in the calls your customers are receiving. To close, I'd like to thank all the presenters, panelists and participants for their time, attention and valued input to the EMEA Call Trust seminar. And at this point, I'd normally wish you all a safe journey home, but currently that's from your home office to your kitchen. So it leaves me to hope you stay healthy and look forward to talking to you about the Ribbon Call Trust portfolio in the very near future. Thank you and stay safe.